Where the hell did it go? I just want the freaking the chat to be popping out. All right. I guess it is the way it is. It is the way it is. The lag on this is ridiculous because I'm out of my garage and I couldn't. Okay, close that. All right. Make sure everything's good so I don't get no. All right, I'm just gonna. Where is it? Put this up and not worry about it. If there's any problems, just let me know. All right, let's see. Whiskey. Oh, went too far. Mass Reeves. What the hell is going on with this thing?
So, you open Google Chrome on your phone.
Sorry, I'm trying to pick something to listen to. All right, let's do it.
Boost your savings and benefits at Ralph's with a free 30-day trial of a Boost by Ralph's Rewards. You'll get 2 times fuel points on groceries and merchandise in-store with pickup or delivery. Your fuel points add up as you shop, too, and you won't even have to drive to earn them. Plus, get free delivery on...
Sorry, I'm just trying to get ready. I'm trying to get set up. I should have got this, but I kind of started late on the stream.
Boost by Ralph's Rewards. A new level of membership has arrived. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at ralphs.com/boost. $35 order minimum. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Here's to the wine with that enchanting Italian name. Here's to its chilled, delightful fizz that springs to life as thousands of tiny bubbles dance in your mouth.
I updated that camera, so hopefully it looks better than it did yesterday. So, I like the way this gemstone came out. I have to do some touch-ups to it. As you can see, it's really dark before I move on. And then there's a couple places I didn't get, like right here, and let's see.
Harmon Hayes served in the War of 1812 and had great respect for his
and then the top.
officer. His commanding officer, in turn,
like I gotta go from this line,
officer, General Andrew Jackson.
down to here and back up. So
Harmon Hayes was also loosely related to the two men through marriage, and his modest spread in Little Cedar Lake, Tennessee, was just up the road from Andrew Jackson's sprawling estate called the Hermitage. So when Harmon had a boy 5 years after the War of 1812,
I don't know if I should
there
use
were
my
two
wet palette
fairly
for
obvious
this.
choices for
If
who
I
to name
do,
the child
damn it.
after.
I gotta
One was Andrew Jackson, of course. But Harmon
make some
chose the
changes.
other.
Let me get set up.
He chose the name of his immediate superior officer. Harmon's commanding officer was John Coffey, and Harmon's first son became John Coffey Hayes. John Coffey Hayes went on to hold many titles of his own, but above all, he's known as the preeminent captain of a motley crew of fierce fighters who were called on by Texans from the Red River to the Rio Grande for protection. Under his leadership, the ever-evolving group of horsemen, who were given many labels over the years, became known by one name: the Texas Rangers.
So with a wet palette, you always gotta keep it wet. Obviously, that's a wet palette. But these are real good.
From
I like
Black
it.
Barrel Media, this is Season 5 of the Legends of the Old West podcast, presented by the Cowboy Lifestyle Network. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this is the first episode of a 5-part series on the Texas Rangers. Longtime listeners will remember that I did 2 episodes on the Rangers way back in Season 1. These episodes will pick up where those left off. This season, we'll hear about the men who turned the Rangers into a cohesive fighting force, and the events that led the world to know the name Texas Rangers. And now, here's episode 1 of the Texas Rangers. A Captain Rises.
Some say a rising tide lifts all boats. The truth is, the tide has left many people.
Why is
out.
there so
The
much
one
commercial?
who simply comment, share a few links, and move on. Students at Alliant Internet learn more at Alliant.
Stream on Hulu and
Their quest ended with the destruction of the town of Linville on the Gulf Coast. The devastation was so complete, the town was never rebuilt. Today, a simple stone tablet next to a highway marks the spot where the town once stood. Word of the raid spread quickly, and men from all over the young republic raced in to help. A combined force of Texas Rangers and the fledgling Texas Army set an ambush for the Comanches at Plum Creek between San Antonio and Austin. As the Comanche column moved slowly back toward its homeland in northwest Texas, it rode straight into the trap set by the Texans. The fight that took place that day was probably the strangest sight ever recorded in the West.
Where's my 4?
Comanche warriors, the fiercest fighters on the southern plains, were dressed in costumes stolen from Linville. They wore top hats and brightly colored ribbons and carried ladies' parasols, and they were not prepared for battle. The Texans routed the Comanches, and the survivors raced back to their native lands called the Comancheria. The Battle of Plum Creek was August 12th, 1840. Among the many Texans who were present that day were 2 men who would fight side by side for the next 8 years and pave the way for the Rangers of the future: Ben McCullough and John Coffey Hayes. Jack Hayes, as he was called, was something of a paradox. He was a small man, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and slim, with wavy brown hair. In society, he was polite, courteous, soft-spoken, and modest. But on the battlefield, he was an absolute
Gotta mix this paint up good. Hey, if you guys are like
He
miniature
thundered
painting,
forward to meet the enemy and shouted commands
this
in a clear,
mixer is
authoritative
great.
voice.
It was like
When Jack
$10
Hayes
on
was
Amazon.
present, there was no doubt who was in
Saves you a
charge.
lot of time with doing
He
this
left his home in
noise.
Tennessee at 15 and worked as a surveyor in Mississippi. He brought his survey skills to Texas sometime in 1838 and set up shop in San Antonio. Texas had won its independence from Mexico at the Battle of San Jacinto 2 years earlier, and now General Sam Houston was finishing his term as the first president of the new republic. That new republic needed good surveyors to scout land grants, and Hayes quickly found himself in high demand. On his survey expeditions, he frequently came in contact with native warriors, and he quickly honed his fighting skills. Between surveys, he enlisted in the ranging companies of
Now
Colonel
I have my
Henry
GoPro
Carnes
set up. I don't have to
and
worry
immediately
about
impressed all those
camera
around
view
him.
because I can see it right there.
In his first mission with Carnes, he killed a Comanche and helped stave off an attack while the Rangers were outnumbered 10-1. Before long, Carnes had chosen Hayes to lead the advanced scouting parties for Ranger companies.
How am I doing this?
And then came the Great Comanche Raid of 1840 and the Battle of Plum Creek. Hayes likely had a small role in the battle, as more experienced Rangers took control. But after 2 years of solid surveying and fighting on the southwestern frontier, his star was on the rise. Almost exactly 5 months after the Battle of Plum Creek, Hayes was given command of his 1st Ranger Company. There were probably few decisions made in the early days of the Republic that paid greater dividends than this one.
All right, sorry, I gotta put on a glove.
With his
I can
top
feel
lieutenant
it.
Ben McCullough, was about to revolutionize the Rangers, smash the Comanches, and demoralize Mexican bandits. And all this before he led the Rangers to war.
If you guys don't listen to, it's on Spotify, and I think they have it on YouTube too.
Texas was a republic for almost 10 years.
Legends of the Old West.
Those years were full of constant turmoil and change. First, the Texas Constitution said the initial president could only hold office for 2 years. Each president after that would hold office for 3 years. Second, the president could not hold office for 2 consecutive terms. This guaranteed the possibility of complete upheaval in the government every 3 years, and the possibility became reality. General Sam Houston, the hero who had led Texas to victory over Mexico in 1836, became the Republic's first president the same year. He held office until 1838. One of the constants of Houston's political career was that he wanted to make peace with the native tribes. When he left office after 2 years, his vice president, Mirabeau Lamar, took over. Lamar was the exact opposite of Houston. He wanted the native tribes removed or exterminated. During his presidency, he forced the tribes of East Texas off their lands and ordered the Rangers to take the fight to the Comanches and the Kiowas in the west. In these 3 years, Jack Hayes became a trusted ranger under Henry
They come out
Collins,
actually better than
and
I
then was
thought.
given his own command. As the line of white settlements
There you
pushed west
go.
across Texas, from the Red River in the north to the Rio Grande in the south, it inevitably pressed up against the boundary of the Comanches' homeland.
Yeah,
After
boy.
Texas won its independence, it claimed all the land from Mexico that had once been the province of Tejas. This opened up millions of acres of land for settlement. The Texans called these acres vacant lands. They were vacant because no white person lived there, and the Comanches who did live there had no system of ownership as it existed in European society.
So
And this was
apparently,
one of the 2 biggest
it was like
chasms between
my
European
video had a
cultures
worldwide
and
ban
native
because it
cultures,
wasn't
the
showing
idea of ownership of land.
end games. It
The
was just
history
the
of
voice of
European
it.
cultures was built on
So
the idea of being able to claim land.
I was like,
Land
what the
that was
hell?
sometimes thousands of miles away and existed only as vague lines on an unfinished map. To the Comanches, this concept was unimaginable. Their hunting grounds included parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. It was basically a giant circle on the southern plains. It never would have occurred to them to claim California, for instance. They had never seen it. They had never been there. They had no use for it. They hunted over a range that was as big as they could hold by force. So when Texas settlements encroached on the traditional hunting grounds of the Comanches and their Kiowa allies, the tribes fought for them. Captain Jack Hayes and his Rangers would come in contact with the Comanches soon enough. But his first mission was to tame the region southwest of San Antonio, a region with an ominous nickname. After the Texas Revolution, trade routes and smuggling lanes sprang up between Mexico and San Antonio. Legitimate traders were constantly harassed by Mexican bandits. The region was commonly known as the Nueces Strip, and it became a haven for rustlers, killers, and thieves. It earned the nickname El Desierto Muerto, the Dead Desert. It was a disputed zone between Texas and Mexico. Though Mexico refused to officially recognize Texas, it also claimed that the border between the 2 nations was the Nueces River. Texas, of course, claimed the border was the next river south, the Rio Grande.
Yeah.
So the strip of land between the 2 rivers was a hotly contested area, and it would ignite a full-scale war in just 4 years. But for now, it was full of marauders who needed to be dealt with. 2 prominent gangs operated in the area with the protection and support of the Mexican military commander at Laredo. Laredo, on the Rio Grande River, was the staging ground for many of the attacks on merchants, so that's exactly where Jack Hayes went. He was given command of what was called either a spy company or a ranger spy company on January 10th, 1841, and he led his scout directly to Laredo. He and his rangers rode into town, surprised the hell out of the Mexican soldiers stationed there, seized some horses, and then herded them out of town. The next day he came back with the horses and a warning. He said this was just a demonstration. Next time, it'll be worse. The harassment of travelers stops now. It was a fine display, but unfortunately, it did not dissuade the outlaws. Not long after Hayes returned to San Antonio, 2 traders came to town saying they'd been robbed by bandit Captain Agaton Quinones and his 30 men. Quinones and Manuel Leal were the 2 strongest outlaw chieftains in the Nueces Strip, and it was time for Jack Hayes to make a move against one of them. He recruited 13 men and was joined by a volunteer captain named Antonio Perez and his 12 recruits. The cadre headed straight for Laredo. 10 miles outside of town, they were met by Captain Ignacio Garcia, the military commander who supported the bandits. He had 15 soldiers and 25 outlaws with him. The Mexican force charged and fired, but did little damage. The Rangers returned fire and killed 1 soldier and wounded another. Garcia then tried to surround the Texans, but Hayes rushed his men out of danger. They jumped their horses over a ravine and found a safe area in some thick brush. Hayes and most of his men dismounted and left their horses with 5 Rangers. The rest of the company crept through the brush toward Garcia's unsuspecting soldiers. When they were 60 yards from Garcia's men, they rose up out of the brush and fired. They killed 2 soldiers and wounded several others. The Texans raced back to their horses. They leapt on their mounts and reloaded as they charged at the shocked Mexicans. The Mexicans retreated for several hundred yards and tried to make a stand, but failed. They broke and ran. Hayes and his Rangers captured all but 3 horses. Those 3 were being used by Captain Garcia and 2 other men as they galloped away from the scene. Of the remaining men, 3 were dead. 3 were severely wounded. Several others were injured, and the rest were taken prisoner. Garcia rode into Laredo telling tales of slaughter at the hands of the Texans. The engagement wasn't exactly a slaughter, but it had the desired effect. The alcalde, or mayor, of Laredo hurried out to meet with Hayes and to beg him not to destroy the town. Hayes said he only wanted 2 things: safe passage for the traders and the 2 bandit captains. He never got the desperados, but someone took care of Quinones for him. The bandit captain was killed 2 years later, in 1843.
Always remember to wash your brush over
Jack Hayes was
every
known
minute.
to his men as Captain Jack, but in the summer of 1841, he earned the name by which he was known to his Apache scouts.
Captain
Brave
Jack.
too much. He had done good work against the bandits in the Nueces Strip, and now President Lamar sent him against the Comanches. In June, a raiding party had struck a settlement and made off with some cattle. Hayes raised a force of 13 men and took off after them. He was later joined by more volunteers to bring his total to 24, but after he discovered the Comanche camp in present-day Frio Canyon, he realized he was still badly outnumbered. Jack was brave. He wasn't stupid. And then he spotted a small group of Comanches leaving the camp. He assumed they were about to raid San Antonio.
Hold on, I'll be right back. Yes. Let's see, hold on. It's June. Oh. June 23rd. The day before. Yeah. Come back so Thursday, Friday, Sunday. Yep, that's it. Okay. Okay, bye. Nope. Nope. Okay. Bye.
So he attacked. His men killed all but 2 of the Comanches, but his group still.
Let's see. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that.
Canyon. As his larger force approached, the Comanches got spooked. They killed the prisoners they had recently captured and hurried out of the canyon. Hayes and his men galloped after them. The long, ragged pursuit plunged into the hill country west of present-day Kerrville, Texas. The next 2 days were a series of running fights. At one point, Hayes charged a group of Comanches by himself. He had meant to rush in, fire his weapon, and then rush out. But in the heat of battle, his horse got excited and ran right through the middle of the Comanches, carrying Hayes with it. Chief Flacco, the leader of the Apache Scouts, vowed never to be left behind by anyone, so he followed his captain through the group of Comanches. The 2 men miraculously emerged on the other side without a scratch. Chief Flacco, not knowing Hayes' gallant charge had been an accident, named him Brave Too Much. The act had certainly been unintended and unexpected, but the name was still valid. The Rangers and the Apaches battled the Comanches as the warriors protected the retreat of their women and children. When it was all over, Captain Jack thought his men had probably killed 8 to 10 Comanches and driven the rest out of the area. Chief Flacco is credited with later saying, "Me and Blue Wing not afraid to go to hell together. Captain Jack, great brave, not afraid to go to hell by himself." And Captain Jack was not alone in his success. All over the Texas frontier, ranger companies were smashing into Comanche camps. President Lamar's aggressive policies toward the Comanches were having an effect. The Texans didn't know it at the time, but the southern branch of the Comanches virtually abandoned their lands in Texas and moved their lodges north to the Arkansas River and the Canadian River in Oklahoma. The raids slowed down, briefly, but tensions with Mexico heated up. Dictator Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who lost the Battle of San Jacinto that created the Republic of Texas 5 years earlier, was once again in control, and he wanted Texas back. 1842 became a year of invasions.
I didn't know
Sam Houston was elected president
Santa-
of Texas for the
Santa Ana
second
went
time
back
at the
to
end of 1841, and he
Texas?
immediately faced 2 challenges: crippling debt and his old nemesis Santa Anna. President Lamar had had great success against the Comanches on the frontier, but he had spent a ton of money to do it. Now, Houston was in desperate need of the Rangers, but he had no money to pay them. And 3 months after Houston took office, Santa Anna sent his first expedition into Texas to test the young republic, and in retaliation for one of Lamar's ideas. The back and forth had started in the summer of 1841. Lamar sent an expedition west from Austin to open a road to Santa Fe, and to explore the possibility of annexing New Mexico. The Texas Congress had voted against the expedition, but Lamar sent it anyway. It started out bad and only got worse. In June 1841, 320 men and a wagon train of supplies left the Austin area and traveled north. They planned to follow the Red River across the Texas Panhandle and let it guide them toward New Mexico. But then they struck the Wichita River and thought it was the Red, and mistakenly followed it for 12 days. Eventually, they learned their error and found the Red River. They followed it out to the most desolate part of Texas at that time, the homeland of the Comanches, called the Llano Estacado. That's the American pronunciation of the Spanish name that means the Staked Plains. It's dry, flat, and arid. You could travel for days without seeing something worthy of the name tree or a water source. and that's when the expedition's Mexican guides abandoned the effort. Now the Texans were in barren lands with no guides, and the Kiowas attacked them. In early September, after 3 months of travel, the warriors killed 6 men. A few days later, the Kiowas came back and stampeded all the cattle and 83 horses. The guides who had deserted the expedition made it to Taos, New Mexico around the same time as the attacks, and they alerted the Mexican authorities. By mid-September, the entire expedition had been captured by Mexican soldiers. The Texans were marched all the way south to Mexico City and then east to Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. In December 1841, just as Lamar was transferring the presidency to Houston, Texas learned the full extent of the failed expedition. Most of the prisoners were released in April 1842. And if this story sounds familiar, Larry McMurtry, author of the Lonesome Dove novels, borrowed it for the plot of Dead Man's Walk, the story of the first adventures of Texas Rangers Woodrow Call and Augustus McCrae.
Oh.
He combined it with another failed mission you'll hear about shortly. In retaliation for the Santa Fe expedition, Mexican dictator Santa Anna sent 700 soldiers north to San Antonio. In March of 1842, they were spotted by Texas Ranger Ben McCullough.
Hammock? Check. Arnold Palmer? Check. Motorized solar shades? Yes, please. Get your home spring ready with Blinds.com. Upgrading your home with custom window treatments from Blinds.com is a small project with a huge impact. Relax and let Blinds.com handle the install. It's easy. Just click installation at checkout. Plus, Blinds.com has a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Save 45% off selected products at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This episode is brought to you by Cliff Kid, makers of Z-Bar. Parents, say goodbye to half-eaten snack bars abandoned for tasting like cardboard. And say hello to Cliff Kid Z-Bar Energy Snack Bars. With a mouth-watering
Jeez, I was hoping to put the
texture
speed paint on
and kid
and then
favorite
move on
flavors like
to,
chocolate
well,
chip and iced oatmeal cookie, these organic whole grain bars have the taste kids love. Visit cliffkid.com to learn more. That's CLIF kid.com.
Ben McCullough and another ranger hid in the brush of southwest Texas and watched as 700 Mexican troops marched toward San Antonio. The rangers were helpless to stop the soldiers or warn the town. Captain Jack Hayes was out in the field with 100 rangers, but McCullough had no way to contact him or locate him. One day before the 6th anniversary of the fall of the Alamo, the Mexican army marched into San Antonio and captured the town with no resistance. Shortly thereafter, Jack Hayes returned with his rangers and discovered the occupation. But with only 100 men, he was badly outnumbered. He stationed his men south of the city and waited for the reinforcements he was certain would arrive once word spread of the incursion. But then the Mexican army abandoned San Antonio as quickly as it had arrived. The soldiers had plundered the town, but apparently this was not the first step of an all-out invasion. It was retaliation for the Santa Fe expedition, and possibly a test by Santa Anna to see how easy it might be to avenge his loss to the hated Texans. The Mexican troops marched toward the Rio Grande, and Hayes' Rangers shadowed them the whole way, but he knew it would be crazy to attack such a large force with his small number. Afterward, Texas howled. The old rivalry had been renewed.
all right, let me
Mexico
do
had
it
sent soldiers onto the sovereign soil of the Republic. The
underneath.
Texas Congress called for war, and Sam Houston said, "Hey, not so fast. We're broke. We have no money for a standing army. We are not going to war." Houston promoted Jack Hayes to major and put him in command of the entire southwest portion of Texas. By early September 1842, rumors were swirling of another expedition by Mexican forces. Hayes learned that the rumors were true, and he led his men out to scout the main road from Mexico to San Antonio. And in a very rare slip-up, he was outsmarted by an opponent. 1,500 men under a French soldier of fortune named Adrian Wall crossed the Rio Grande at Laredo and marched toward San Antonio. And now Wall outmaneuvered Hayes. While Hayes watched the road, Wall led his troops through the hills outside of town and slipped behind Hayes while the whole area was covered in a dense fog. Instead of marching straight in from the southwest, Wall came around from the north and easily captured San Antonio. Hayes returned to town the next day to find he'd been beaten, but he wasn't out of the fight. He sent riders in every direction to sound the alarm that San Antonio had fallen. Veteran Ranger Captain Matthew Caldwell brought a company of volunteers from Seguin. Henry McCullough, younger brother of Ben, added more volunteers to the unit. Over the next 4 days, the Rangers' numbers swelled to 225, but that still wasn't a quarter of the size of the Mexican force.
Oh, I keep hitting the
The
camera.
Texans didn't care. They were determined to do battle with the Mexican army this time. Caldwell was elected commander of the Texans by a vote from the troops, and he arranged his men along Salado Creek southwest of San Antonio. He knew he couldn't fight the Mexican army in a traditional battle on open ground, so he chose a spot where his men could fight from cover. Jack Hayes led a decoy squad toward town to entice General Wall to come out and fight, and the general did. Hayes and his men raced back toward their chosen battleground at Salado Creek, and the Mexican troops began to stream in behind him. All morning, as Wall assembled his troops for an assault on the Texans, the Rangers harassed his flanks. By the afternoon, Wall was ready for an attack. The Mexicans had 2 cannons, and now they roared to life. They blasted canister and grape shot at the Texans, but the Rangers were barricaded behind ravines in the creek bed, and the cannon shots smashed into the trees over their heads, doing little damage. The center of the Mexican line fired at the Texans. The right and left flanks charged forward. As the soldiers rushed toward the Texans' entrenched lines, the Rangers rose up and fired straight into them. Volleys of musket fire exploded on both sides of the battlefield. On the left flank, a Mexican
Looking
unit
good.
tried to get around the edge of the Texan defenses.
It's almost time for me to
Jack
go
Hayes
to.
sent 10 men around the side with double-barrel shotguns.
Gold is going to be the last.
They let the Mexicans get within 30 feet, and then they opened up with all 20 barrels.
The next is the silver. Oh, well, I gotta speed paint this stuff.
Cutting
And,
down every man. On the right flank, General Wall stubbornly
but the
continued
speed
to
paint
send
shouldn't take too
men
long, but I do
He
gotta
sent
let this
Frank
dry.
Lewis's cavalry to circle around behind the Texans' lines. A Mexican unit charged the ravine on the right and was met by a company led by Ewan Cameron. The engagement turned into a vicious hand-to-hand battle. Muskets, pistols, and shotguns were fired at close range, and then knives, sabers, and bayonets clashed and sliced into the men. The Rangers killed 14 men of the Mexican unit. In the main engagement near the creek, the Rangers held their own against superior numbers.
I don't know what
But
that is.
northwest of the creek, they suffered a devastating tragedy. Captain Nicholas Dawson was leading his 53 men from LaGrange, Texas,
Alright, I don't
toward the
want to mess that
battlefield
up some more.
when they ran straight into 2 companies of Mexican cavalry who had a cannon. The Mexicans pinned the Texans down in a mesquite thicket and shelled them with cannon fire and volleys from their rifles. 36 Rangers died in the thicket as the sun went down on the battle. As darkness crept
Okay,
in,
yeah. No more. I'm not touching that helmet
General
anymore.
Wall's troops.
At least where the eye
battle had
part is,
essentially been a
the front
draw,
of it.
But it convinced Wall that Texas would not be easy to retake. The Mexican army trudged back across the Rio Grande, and the second incursion was over. But unlike the first, President Sam Houston could not
I
let
don't
this
have
one go
anything to hold
unanswered.
this thing.
Less than 10 days later, he authorized a retaliatory strike.
I mean, the best I can do
It would
is
bring 4 legendary Texas Rangers together for the
Just
first time, and it was an
that.
unmitigated disaster. Samuel Walker landed at Galveston Island in February 1842, just a couple weeks before Mexico's first expedition to San Antonio. He was born in Maryland in 1817, the same year as Jack Hayes. His father fought in the Revolutionary War, and he craved all the romantic notions of chivalry and adventure. He fought in the Second Seminole War in Florida at the same time Texas was fighting its revolution. By the early 1840s, he looked for adventure elsewhere and turned his sights to the hotbed of Texas. He joined up with the Rangers, but arrived at Salado Creek in time to bury the fallen men of Nicholas Dawson's company, and not much else. But he was was in the right place at the right time for the next adventure, as President Sam Houston needed to appease his citizens. On October 3rd, 1842, less than 2 weeks after the fight at Salado Creek, Houston put Brigadier General Alexander Somerville in charge of the strike against Mexico. It may have been a Machiavellian
Had to
move on Houston's part.
trim
He knew the
a
Texans
brush,
didn't have
trim the
resources
brush
to
because it had like a
and
little
train an elite
hair.
fighting force that could genuinely challenge a professional army. But he had to placate his constituents. After 2 invasions, he had to retaliate against Mexico. So he likely crafted a strategy that he knew wouldn't do much good, but he also
Now
feared
it's
would do
just
much harm.
I gotta
The
wait a little bit
volunteers in
for this
San
thing to
Antonio
dry.
who answered his call to arms were a tough,
I don't have a
rowdy
hairbrush,
bunch.
a hair dryer.
And Somerville was a weak, indecisive leader. If the expedition fell apart, which it probably would, Houston could claim he had tried, but the blame would fall on Somerville. Houston gave Somerville just one instruction: take Jack Hayes and his
What can I
Rangers.
paint next? Well, I put
Most
this
of the men who
aside.
had fought at Salado Creek signed up for the new expedition.
Actually, you know what? I was gonna try something,
Another man who
and
would soon
hopefully it
become a legend.
works to finish off this. So let me move this, the Hulk Buster, away for a little
Wallace
bit.
was a Virginian by birth.
While this dries a
Although he
little
was
more.
the same age as Hayes and Walker, he was a giant compared to those 2 men. They were of average height and slight
Okay.
build. Wallace was 6 feet 2 inches tall
Let's go
and
with
weighed 240
Venom here.
pounds. He had enormous hands and
let's
long
see.
arms, and was given the nickname Bigfoot, though ironically, not because of the size of his feet. One night, one of Wallace's neighbors discovered food had been stolen from his house. The intruder
See, I
had
kinda
left
wanna get
huge
this
footprints that led
The
right to Wallace's
veins
door.
to pop on
The
this.
neighbor accused Wallace of raiding his
So
pantry.
let me
and
find
Wallace
white.
promptly walked over to the tracks in the mud. The tracks were much bigger than his feet, which proved he was innocent. The neighbor apologized, and they later learned the intruder had been a Waco chief named Bigfoot. The nickname was then given to Wallace, and it stuck. Wallace had a grandfather and 4 uncles who fought for the
All right, got me
Continental during the American Revolution,
some.
and he himself fought for Texas during its revolution. His older brother Samuel and 2 of his cousins died in the Goliad Massacre in 1836. He initially settled in the LaGrange area and rode with many ranger patrols before moving to Austin in 1839. But city life never appealed to him. He was a frontiersman through and through. So when it came time to march to Mexico, he was ready for another fight. The bulk of the summer
Ooh, that is a
expedition
big delay.
left San Antonio November 12th, 1842, bound for Laredo. Hayes and his ranger company included our familiar names: Ben and Henry McCullough, Samuel Walker, and Bigfoot Wallace. After 3 weeks of marching through brutal weather, the expedition finally reached Laredo, and then it promptly fell apart. Many men elected to return home, and a week later came the big split. The column had wandered downriver from Laredo until it found some boats. The men then floated 60 miles downriver from Laredo to the town of Guerrero. By that point, the expedition had been traveling for a month, and most of the men were miserable. Somerville officially disbanded the expedition and ordered the men to return home. But only 189 of the roughly 500 who were still there obeyed the order. The others, displaying the true Texas independent spirit, elected to continue. Somerville and Hayes decided to turn back, but surprisingly, many of Hayes' Rangers decided to stay,
All right.
at least for a little while. The new expedition selected William Fisher as its commander. Ben McCullough, Henry McCullough, Samuel Walker,
Hopefully this
Bigfoot
works.
Wallace,
I haven't
and their good friend Robert
tried it.
Addison Gillespie all stayed with the company. Ben McCullough and a small unit scouted the town of Mere several miles south. McCullough was alarmed to discover 1,500
Oh.
Mexican troops were marching on Mere. After the expedition's appearance at Laredo, the secret was clearly out. McCullough immediately recommended that the expedition head for the interior of Texas. Fisher refused. He and many others wanted to stay and fight. The McCullough brothers and Robert Gillespie did not. On Christmas Eve, 1842, they left the expedition and returned home. It would prove to be one of the smartest decisions of their lives. Samuel Walker, who loved adventure, and Bigfoot Wallace, who wanted revenge for his brother's death at Goliad, stayed
I think I
behind.
might have press down too
On
hard.
Christmas Day,
I gotta paint that black again,
261
which is
Texans
fine.
attacked 3,000 Mexican soldiers at Mir. For being outnumbered more than 10 to 1, the Texans gave the Mexicans an incredible fight. For a day and a half, the battle raged through the streets of Mir.
Yep, no, that
Wallace
ain't gonna
and
work.
Captain Ewan Cameron fought
That ain't
until
gonna
it was
work.
impossible to fight any longer. They were some of the last to give up,
Damn it.
and only did so when they were outnumbered 2,500 to 40. After 2 days of fighting, the surviving Texans surrendered. And now, the real pain began.
Oh, shouldn't have done that.
Santa Anna was livid, and his mood only grew darker. The Texans who surrendered at Mir were marched to Camargo, about 25 miles down the Rio Grande, and then to Matamoros near the Gulf of Mexico, another 100 miles away. From there, they marched to Monterrey, 190 miles inland. After Monterrey, they marched another 50 miles to Saltillo. By that time, they were starving, ragged, and beyond exhausted.
Gotta find my
They had
matte
marched
black.
under guard for 6 weeks. They didn't think they could take it any longer, so they escaped. On February 11th, 1843, Ewan Cameron, Bigfoot Wallace, and Samuel Walker led a jailbreak. The Texans overpowered their guards and fled into the hills around Saltillo. In the process, they killed 5 Mexican soldiers. Wallace and a few others remained free for 8 days before they surrendered again. They'd been eating snakes and grasshoppers and anything else they could find, and they'd been dying of thirst. When a Mexican patrol found them, they gave up. Only 5 men made it all the way back to Texas. 7 died of starvation. 3 were never seen again.
I'm gonna have to paint this all over again, and then I'm gonna have to go with the white.
He ordered all the survivors executed, but he was convinced to amend the order so that only every 10th man would be killed. Then came the famous drawing of the beans, again immortalized in Larry McMurtry's novel Dead Man's Walk. A jar was filled with white beans and 17 black beans. Each Texan had to reach inside and pull out a bean. If he grabbed a white bean, he lived. If he pulled a black bean, he died. Bigfoot Wallace and Samuel Walker both drew white beans and lived. Wallace later claimed he had seen the black beans poured in after the white beans, so he assumed they were lying close to the top. When it was his turn, he dug deep in the jar for his bean and pulled out a white one. Ranger Captain Ewan Cameron was not allowed to participate. As the leader of the jailbreak, Santa Anna ordered him to be executed without fail. The remaining 159 Texans were marched to Mexico City, where they were subjected to a year of back-breaking labor as prisoners. They lived on the edge of starvation, and those who survived the work, the conditions, and the epidemics of sickness were finally released in the spring and summer of 1844. They did not include Samuel Walker. Walker and 2 companions actually made a successful prison break in July 1843. They somehow worked their way to Tampico on the Gulf Coast and then took a ship to New Orleans. In January 1844, while Bigfoot Wallace still suffered in Mexico City, Samuel Walker traveled from New Orleans to San Antonio, and he carried with him a burning hatred for Mexico. Wallace was released in August 1844, and after a long, punishing journey, he arrived at Galveston Island in October. He was finally back in Texas, nearly 2 years after the expedition began. And at this point, you might think Mexico was the last place Wallace and Walker would want to go after they narrowly survived the Mir expedition. But you'd be wrong. 1 year after Wallace was released from prison in Mexico City, General Zachary Taylor landed at Corpus Christi, Texas, with 3,500 American soldiers. They were bound for Mexico and war. In the summer of 1844, Hayes, Walker, and the Texas Rangers fought a small battle with Comanches. But that little engagement would end up impacting the entire history of the American West. A year later, Texas joined the American Union, and America went to war with Mexico. The Rangers were at the forefront of nearly every major battle, and by the time they were done in Mexico, it was said that Mexicans didn't know who they feared more, the devil or the Texas Rangers. The beginning of the Mexican-American War is next time on the Legends of the Old West podcast. This season was edited and mixed by Michael Martin at Sneaky Big Studios in Phoenix, Arizona. The theme song, Yellow Rose of Texas, was arranged and recorded by the Mighty Orc in Houston, Texas. Much of the music for this show was produced by Rob Valier in Phoenix. And a very special thank you to Matt Lowry in Ireland for producing color images of these famous Texas Rangers for the first time. Matt is a world-renowned photographer whose project My Colorful Past breathes new life into old photos. Check out his Facebook page for more of his
I want to
work.
bring out the veins, but I don't know how.
And, as always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening.
I'm not good at
You can check out our website,
dry brushing just yet. Like,
blackberrymedia.com,
from the
for
beginning,
details,
I can
and
dry
follow
brush
us on
pretty
social
good.
media for news of the show. Our Facebook page is Legends of the Old West Podcast, and our handles on Twitter and Instagram are @OldWestPodcast. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.
Socks are the #1 most requested item at homeless shelters. Underwear second, and shirts are third. At Bombas, socks were first, made with comfortable details for everyday wearing. Then underwear and shirts
I should
too,
do the
all
back.
designed to perfectly fit. At Bombas, every item you purchase means you're donating an essential clothing item to someone in need. One comfortable clothing item for you, one donated to someone in need. Bombas, comfort for all. Get 20% off your purchase at bombas.com/Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Azo. This is for my listeners with a vagina. Ever felt off balance down there? Introducing Azo Vaginal Health Products. Azo
kind
Complete
of fucking
Feminine
commercial is
Balance
that?
helps restore the balance of good bacteria. And if you want protection from yeast and urinary tract issues, try Azo Dual Protection. Save 20% with the promo code PODCAST at azoproducts.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Jeez, I need a bigger brush.
Ben McCullough was a native of Tennessee, like Jack Hayes, and so many of the early settlers in Texas.
Oh, I got one.
By the time Ben was 24 years old in 1835, he and his younger brother Henry had decided they would seek their fortunes in Texas. Their plan was to travel with a man who had been their lifelong friend and neighbor. He was running for Congress, and if he failed, they would all go to Texas together. He did fail, but he was so anxious to get started, he left without the brothers. They hurried after him, but once they made it to Texas, Ben convinced Henry that he should go back to Tennessee for a while and take care of their aging parents. They would reunite again in the near future, but for now, Ben continued into Texas alone and arrived just in time to join the revolution. His reunion with that old friend from Tennessee who had rushed to Texas ahead of him was brief. Just 1 year after Ben arrived in Texas, his old friend died in the siege of the Alamo.
Alright.
That friend was legendary frontiersman
Davy Crockett. As soon as he said Frontier Legend, I knew exactly.
From Black Barrel Media, this is Season 5 of the Legends of the Old West podcast, presented by the Cowboy Lifestyle Network. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this is the second episode of a 5-part series on the Texas Rangers.
Alright. I got a bigger brush right there.
Some say a rising tide lifts all boats. The truth is, the tide has left many people behind. And while most simply comment, share a few links, and move on, students at Aligned International University prefer to act, pursuing graduate degrees under dedicated professors and faculty, alongside others who believe in equity, inclusivity, and social justice. Let's challenge the culture of complacency and start to succeed on purpose. Learn more at alliant.edu/purpose.
This episode is brought to you by Redbox RX. Get extension-like lashes without the work with Redbox RX. They'll help provide a prescription for bimatoprost, a medically proven eyelash serum with the same FDA-approved active ingredient as Latisse. You could see longer, thicker, darker eyelashes in just 8 weeks. And at Redbox RX, it's only $11.40 a week. You won't find a cheaper price online. Take a free assessment today and use the code Spotify for 10% off at redboxrx.com.
Anyone interested in the early years of the Texas Rangers is indebted to men like James Wilson Nichols. Nichols kept a journal, and he wrote about his experience in a ranger company led by Captain Jack Hayes and Lieutenant Ben McCullough. Nichols wrote, "We kept scouts out all the time. When one would come in, another would go out. And those not on a
There you
scout
go.
were every day practicing horsemanship and marksmanship.
I guess this is.
The Rangers would plant posts.
I
in
really
the
gotta
ground
figure out
40
something that'll
yards
pop
apart and as tall as a man.
for Venom. If you guys have any ideas, please leave a comment.
Rangers would ride at full speed toward the first post
'Cause I've been trying to
and fire at it
debate.
with their rifles. They'd keep riding and fire at the second post with their pistols. After 2 months of training, the Rangers could hit a ring on the posts about the size of a man's head. And they could
Do I
ride
need
at
white
full
for anything?
speed and snatch almost any object off the ground without breaking stride. They could lean to the side of the horse
Shit,
and
I
fire
got a
under its
shit
neck
ton of
like
white right there
Comanches,
that I'm
and
about
then
to waste.
straighten up and reverse the maneuver. By the early 1840s, the fighting styles and skills of the Rangers were a
I
far
don't, I
cry
guess-
from the early days when they would ride up to a position, dismount, and fight on foot. They had the horsemanship, the marksmanship, and perhaps most important of all, the Colt revolving pistol. From where we sit today, it might seem like a foregone conclusion that Samuel Colt would become one of the most successful inventors and firearm manufacturers in the country. But for the first 10 years of his professional life,
Samuel L. Colt.
that wasn't even close to the case. He was granted a patent for his 5-shot revolving pistol in 1836, which was produced at his first factory in Paterson, New Jersey. Therefore, it was commonly known as the Paterson Colt. At the time, it was vital for a gun maker to get contracts with governments and armies. They were the only ones that ordered guns in quantities large enough to keep a company in business. Colt sold a small batch to the U.S. government for use in the Second Seminole War in Florida, and another batch to Texas in 1839. But after that, the market dried up. By 1842, he was completely out of business. But the Paterson Colt was becoming a legend in and of itself on the frontier, especially in the hands of men who spent their lives in the saddle and had to fight on horseback. It was the perfect weapon for the Texas Rangers.
Alright.
Well, not
Me
quite
turning
perfect.
off
In a couple years, a Texas Ranger would suggest
YouTube like that in the background kind of helped it out. But I need
It was wonderful.
the YouTube chat, and I don't know why it's not coming up.
Suddenly, a man armed with 2 Paterson Colts could fire 10 shots without reloading, while riding a horse at full gallop in the midst of battle. A single Ranger was now as devastating as an entire unit used to be. Whenever Captain Jack could get his hands on the weapons, he gave them to his men. And in the summer of 1844, they put them to good use against the Comanches.
Undo volume control,
The fight would
copy,
leave a deep impression on the
transform.
mind of Ranger Samuel Walker, and a serious scar on his back.
Advanced auto.
Sam Houston never thought it would be so hard to find the Comanches. He wanted to make peace, but they were ghosts. What he didn't understand at the time was just how well Jack
I don't know
Hayes
why.
and the other Rangers had done their work under President Lamar. For 2 years,
I can't get
Houston
the
sent envoys south,
YouTube chat back.
southwest, west,
So I can't
and
answer
northwest.
nobody.
In a final exasperated
What is
effort,
this?
he sent his
What are
men
you?
north. And they eventually found the Comanches along the Canadian River in present-day Oklahoma. The Comanches were still conducting their lightning-fast murder raids, as settlers called them, but now they were doing them from long range. They would ride south in a wide arc around the line of white settlements and then strike with amazing speed. Many of these strikes weren't even the point of the raids. They were just opportunities. The Comanches were still moving along their old trails through West Texas toward their ultimate target of northern Mexico. When they felt like it or saw the chance, they would hit a farm or a community and then sprint back west before anyone even knew what happened. Texans on the frontier screamed about the atrocities, and Houston deployed the Rangers while trying to make peace. Incidentally, the violence committed against the Texans was bad, there's no doubt.
Multi-view.
But it was moderate compared to the punishment the Comanches inflicted on the people of northern Mexico for 100 years. The suffering of those people would have appalled even the most hardened Texans. But Houston's peace talks of 1843 and 1844 were falling apart, and for obvious reasons. He wanted the Comanches to stay west of the line of white settlements and to stop attacking Texans on the frontier. The Comanche said, okay, if we have to stay west of the line, then you have to stay east of it. That's fair. And of course, Houston said no. No one in the United States or the Republic of Texas could stop the westward expansion of white settlements.
Come on.
Wanted to. So
Property.
the peace talks broke down and the Comanches moved south again, and the raids picked up. And Jack Hayes, Ben McCullough, and Samuel Walker met the
there you
warriors
go.
for a fight along the banks of Walker's Creek in June 1844.
VLC video source text. Oh, and game capture display.
Captain Jack's company of 15 Rangers was
Audio
on a scout
capture
northwest
application.
of San Antonio in present-day Kendall County when they learned they were being tracked by a party of Comanches. Hayes always detailed one man to lag behind the main body to scout for sign. Just because you didn't see any sign didn't mean the Comanches weren't there. Lo and behold, on June 8th, Hayes' trail rider galloped into the ranger camp with a report that he'd seen the tracks of 10
I know what I can do. I think hopefully it
Hayes
works.
spotted a few warriors in the distance, but they drifted into the cover of some brush. Hayes ordered his men to mount up, and they rode toward the brush. 3 or 4 Comanches darted out from behind some trees and pretended to act surprised at the
Pop
sight
out
of
shot.
the
There
Rangers.
you go.
They hurried across a creek, hoping the Rangers would follow.
There you go.
But Hayes was an old hand, and he knew this trick. He stayed put. As soon as the Comanches understood Hayes wasn't going to take the bait, they came out in force. 75 warriors against 15 Rangers. But Hayes didn't see the numbers that way. Each of his men had at least one Patterson Colt revolver.
Drop
Together,
frames,
they could fire at least
65%.
75
Jeez.
shots without reloading. In Hayes' mind, the numbers were about even.
All right.
The Rangers rode slowly toward the Comanches. The warriors had the high
I
ground.
fixed the
They
venom.
backed up toward the top
Now
of the
let's
ridge
get back to
maximize
this.
its value.
Time to
They
speed
taunted
paint.
the Rangers to charge them in their superior position.
So I'm going to speed paint this and then that's it. I'm going to let it dry and then I'm going to move
At the
on
base of the
to...
hill, the Rangers were hidden from the Comanches. Hayes turned his horse and rode around the side of the hill. and
I'll be
the
done for
Rangers
the night.
followed.
Because I want
The
this to dry
Rangers slammed
completely.
into the Comanches from the flank, which completely surprised the warriors.
So
The Rangers opened up with their Colts and scattered the warriors for a moment. But the Comanches regrouped and used their numbers to surround the Rangers.
man, that sucks. That
The
the
Rangers fought back to back in a scene of chaos for 15
Forget
minutes
it.
before the Comanches broke away. A running
All
fight
right,
ensued
so
for 2
I'm
miles
using
until the Comanche leader
blood red.
rallied his men to stand and fight.
speed paint.
By
So
that point, the
speed
Rangers
paint
had almost exhausted their first barrage of shots.
is,
Their Colt pistols
as I
gave
said,
them
it's
great
made
advantage
to
in the
like
fight.
just if you're going to a Warhammer competition, just put it on, let it dry. It doesn't take long to dry, and
He shouted to his men, asking
get to
who
it.
still had a shot in his gun.
So this stuff is very watery. In fact, you can put it in a airbrush and get it going. But these things will get into every single nook and cranny. That's what it's designed for. You just slap it on.
Except for the 20 who were already dead on the
But
ground.
this should
Walker
make,
probably didn't see Gillespie's
like, you
shot.
really don't have to worry. It's going to
He
get
was
everywhere.
clinging to life somewhere
So you
back
can be
on the
very
battlefield.
heavy-handed with this,
He
like
was
that.
pinned to the ground by a Comanche lance that had been driven through his back.
But
It
you
would
can,
take several weeks for Walker to recover, and by the time he did, there was a new, old enemy looming
but this
over the
sucker
horizon.
makes
The final confrontation with
all
Mexico
stand
was
out.
coming up fast, and so was the end of the Texas Republic.
I mean, you still got to make a little effort, but if you mess up, it isn't as
John
bad.
Salmon Ford stood in front of the Texas Congress in June 1845 and proposed a joint resolution. It was a great honor, and he was likely beaming with pride. The bill would approve the annexation of Texas to the United States of America. Ford was born in South Carolina and was 2 years older than Jack Hayes, Samuel Walker, and Bigfoot Wallace.
Like, you really don't even
He
need to
had
worry
come
about the
Texas in
pulling, too.
1836 during the Revolution and worked as a doctor and a surgeon in those early years. But now, in the summer of 1845, he was a congressman in the waning days of the Republic. 6 months earlier, President Sam Houston had finished his second and final term as president of Texas. His hand-picked successor, Dr. Anson Jones, had won the narrowest of narrow victories to become the last president of the Republic. Jones was aligned with Houston in his desire for peace with the Comanches. Jones' opponent, Edward Burleson, was aligned with former President Lamar's policies of war with the Comanches. Burleson had been a stalwart in the Texas military stretching back to the earliest days of the Revolution. In the election, Jones edged out Burleson by a vote of 361 to 360. The more populated eastern counties, which were free from violence by the Comanches and bandits, voted for Jones. The more sparsely populated western counties, which were constantly terrorized by Comanches, voted for Burleson.
Look
In
at
the
that.
end, the population centers won out.
It's going to be very
And it was
different when it dries,
increasingly
though.
clear
Just
to
remember
many
that.
political leaders
It
in
looks
Texas
really
that the
dark, but
Republic needed to join the
it
American
dries.
The Republic had neither the money nor the resources to adequately protect its vast western frontier. It needed the U.S. Army. In March 1845, 4 months after Jones took office, the United States Congress approved Texas statehood. Now, John Ford stood before the Texas Congress and asked it to approve of joining the Union, and it did. But right before that happened,
I'm going to do the head
President
last.
James K. Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor and 3,500 troops to go to Texas. The next 3 years would be a whirlwind as the United States went to war with Mexico, and the gateway to that war was the brand new state of Texas. Mexico was not happy that the United States had extended an offer to Texas to join the American Union. As a result, it broke off diplomatic relations with the U.S. In response, President Polk ordered General Taylor to take some troops to Texas as a precautionary measure, as he put it. In May 1845, Taylor sailed his infantry from Louisiana to Texas and marched his dragoons, the forerunners of the U.S. cavalry, from present-day Oklahoma to Austin. In July, Taylor and his infantry landed in Corpus Christi on the Gulf Coast. When he arrived, General Taylor asked Texas to provide 4 companies of mounted volunteers for federal service,
Texas Rangers.
which meant he wanted the Rangers. Logically, Jack Hayes was made a major and given command of the 4 companies. His 4 captains were John Price, David Cady, Peter Hansborough Bell, and Robert Addison Gillespie. Their mission in these early days was basically the same as it had always been. Guard the southwestern frontier against Comanche attacks and watch out for
See, look, it's already starting to dry.
On December 29th, 1845, Texas officially joined the United States of America as the 28th state. And of course, relations with Mexico did not improve. 6 weeks later, Anson Jones, the final president of the Republic of Texas, transferred power to the first governor of the state of Texas, J. Pinckney Henderson. The first legislature of the new state convened a month later, in March 1846, and high on the agenda was to formally recognize the accomplishments of Major Jack Hayes, Captain Ben McCullough, and Captain Ad Gillespie. At the same time, General Taylor marched his soldiers from Corpus Christi down to the southernmost tip of Texas and established a supply base at Port Isabel. He sent Major Jacob Brown farther inland to establish a fort along the Rio Grande, opposite the Mexican city of Matamoros. The moment Taylor crossed the Nueces River, Mexico considered his movement an invasion of its country. Mexico always viewed the Nueces as the boundary between Texas and itself, while Texas always asserted the Rio Grande was the boundary. Mexico considered Taylor's march into the area known as the Nueces Strip to be an act of war. If it wasn't already, an international conflict was now inevitable. Toward the end of April, Taylor authorized Texas Ranger Samuel Walker to recruit 24 men for a spy company that would act as scouts for his army in South Texas. It took exactly 1 week for Walker and his Rangers to get into a fight, but the first real action came 3 days earlier. On April 25th, 1846, Mexican troops ambushed 63 American dragoons. They killed or wounded 17 men and took the rest prisoner. And at that point, there was no turning back. General Taylor called on Texas to send him more ranger companies, and the Texas government quickly went to work. At dawn on April 28th, Mexican troops surprised Walker's Rangers in their base camp. They charged in and killed 6 Rangers before the rest could scramble away. Later that day, Walker and his company were scouting the road between Taylor's headquarters and Major Brown's garrison at Fort Texas when they ran into 1,500 Mexican soldiers. Many of Walker's Rangers had never seen combat like this, and they broke and ran. Walker and 12 men valiantly covered their escape so they wouldn't be overwhelmed by the superior force. 5 days later, the Mexican army in Matamoros began to shell Fort Texas across the Rio Grande River. At 3 a.m., Walker slipped into the fort and gathered vital intelligence from Major Brown, and then rode through the night to Taylor's camp. Not long after Walker's daring move, Major Brown was killed by cannon fire. In his honor, Fort Texas was renamed Camp Brown, and today, it's the city of Brownsville. Up north in Austin, the governor and the Rangers answered Taylor's call. Governor Henderson gave Jack Hayes command of the 1st Regiment of Mounted Rifles, which was made up of Rangers from West Texas. George Wood was given command of the 2nd Regiment, which was made up of Rangers from East Texas. They joined with 60 men recruited by Ben McCullough and hurried to South Texas to link up with their comrade Sam Walker. Down on the border, Taylor marched his men from his supply base at Portisville toward Fort Texas. As they approached the plain of Palo Alto, they met the Mexican army in the first full engagement of the war. 2,300 Americans clashed with 4,000 Mexicans in a battle.
See what I mean by
that ended in a
heavy-handed?
stalemate as darkness engulfed
I can
them.
just throw this shit on.
The Americans were able
And
to
it gets
counter the Mexicans'
everywhere you
superior
want it
numbers,
to.
thanks to their new flying artillery. Major Samuel Ringgold had developed small cannons mounted on light carriages that could be moved rapidly around the battlefield, and they saved the day for the Americans. The flying artillery would be used to great effect by another young officer later in the war. He was a Virginian named Thomas Jackson, but history would know him by another name because of a battle he would fight in his home state almost exactly 15 years from now. After that battle, he was known as Stonewall Jackson.
Oh shit.
After the bloody stalemate on May 8th, the Mexican army pulled back to Resaca de la Palma at dawn on May 9th. But General Taylor wasn't about to let them leave so easy. In the early morning hours, he attacked and won the day. In the battle, Sam Walker had another close call with an opponent armed with a lance. As Walker charged into the action, his horse was shot out from under him. As he crashed to the ground, a Mexican soldier with a lance tried to stab him. But he shot the man, leapt on the man's horse, and rode back into the fight. The troops at Fort Brown shelled the Mexican army. The Texas Rangers followed the fleeing soldiers relentlessly. They shouted to each other to remember the drawing of the black beans, and they took no prisoners. The Rangers shot every soldier they overtook. They chased them to the Rio Grande, and then over the river and into Matamoros. Once the Rangers' blood was up, they couldn't be stopped. The American Army and the Texas Rangers forced the Mexican commander to retreat southeast toward the interior of the country in the safety of Monterey. 2 days after the pair of engagements, President Polk asked the U.S. Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico, and he got it. Congress authorized 50,000 soldiers for 1 year. 5 days later, Sam Walker and the Texas Rangers scouted
It's already looking
Matamoros
good.
and
Jeez.
discovered the Mexican army had left town. The American army occupied it without a shot fired. And then Samuel Walker became famous. The story of how he was almost killed by a Mexican lancer and then shot the man, jumped on his horse, and led his men into battle hit the newspapers from New Orleans to New York. And for the first time, the name Texas Rangers was printed in wide circulation to describe these wild horse soldiers from America's newest state. Walker was famous nationwide, and so were the Rangers. Jack Hayes and the new Ranger regiments arrived in Matamoros in June 1846.
See how easy that goes on?
Walker and Taylor had pushed out the Mexican army.
It's a beautiful color too.
Hayes was
Yeah, with the
immediately
like they
elevated to
go
colonel,
really good with
given command
metallic.
of all the Rangers, and Walker became his lieutenant colonel. For the first time, Texas Rangers stood shoulder to shoulder with regular U.S. Army troops and officers trained at West Point. The contrast was stark. The Rangers were the dictionary definition of a motley crew. A volunteer in the Louisiana militia decided he wanted to transfer to the Rangers. His name was Samuel Reed, and he joined a company led by Ben McCullough. Reed is another man to whom we're indebted, like James Wilson Nichols, because he kept a journal. When his service in the war ended, he published a book about his time with the Rangers. Here was his first impression of these unique, irregular fighters. Men in groups with long beards and mustaches, dressed in every variety of garment, with one exception, the slouched hat, the unmistakable uniform of a Texas Ranger with a belt of pistols around their waists. A rougher-looking set we never saw. While Hayes and his Rangers awaited their next mission in Mexico, a future Ranger captain slowly sank into the darkest period of his life up in Austin. John Ford, the doctor and politician who had introduced the bill that delivered Texas to the Union, was in the midst of tragedy. His new wife had contracted tuberculosis. She was slowly dying, and there was nothing he could do about it. Throughout the long, hot summer of 1846, he nursed her as best he could, while his future brothers in arms took their war into the heart of Mexico. After the capture of Matamoros, General Taylor instructed the Rangers to scout Reynosa 60 miles up the Rio Grande. When the Rangers arrived at the end of June 1846, their actions laid the foundation for the fearsome reputation they would earn throughout the war. Many Rangers in the regiments had been on the failed Mir expedition just a couple years earlier, and they had been treated terribly at Reynosa. They had not forgotten. Now, first, they did their duty to the army. They scouted the road, they scouted the town, and they determined it was more or less safe. They were under orders to leave unarmed people alone, but now they were the dominant force. They were no longer helpless. They were no longer prisoners. And everywhere around them, they saw people who were responsible for their pain 4 years earlier. Coincidentally, the town of Reynosa experienced a rash of deaths after the Rangers arrived. As Samuel Reed wrote, notorious villains were found shot or hanging from tree limbs. The army decided that these deaths were probably mysterious suicides, and it looked the other way, for now. The strange deaths of the villains could possibly be overlooked, but the accidents continued to mount, and General Taylor was not happy. It was July 4th, 1846, the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the Rangers were in the mood to celebrate. They feasted on chickens and pigs from Reynosa, and they said these poor creatures had died accidentally during the July 4th celebration. There was certainly no need to let the meat go to waste, so they didn't. And during the same celebration, 2 buckets of whiskey also disappeared. It was the damnedest thing. When the Rangers were in town, bad guys suddenly took their own lives. Animals dropped dead in the street, and whiskey evaporated from the face of the earth. General Taylor called the Rangers licentious vandals, and they were only getting started. The real fighting was about to begin as the Rangers and the Army marched on Monterey.
This episode is brought to you by Cliff Kid, makers of Z-Bar. Parents,
So you can see the
say
difference.
goodbye to half-eaten snack bars abandoned for tasting like cardboard, and say hello to Cliff Kid Z-Bar Energy Snack Bars. With a mouth-watering, soft-baked texture and kid-favorite flavors like
Really see the
chocolate chip
difference.
iced oatmeal cookie, these organic whole grain bars have the taste kids love. Visit cliffkid.com to learn more. That's CLIF kid.com.
A lot can happen in the next 3 years. Like a chatbot may be your new best friend. But what won't change? Needing health insurance. United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans are available for these changing times. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, they offer budget-friendly, flexible coverage for people who are in between jobs or missed open enrollment. The plans last nearly 3 years in some states, with access to a nationwide network of doctors and hospitals. So for whatever tomorrow
All right, I gotta put on my headlamp.
United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans may be for you. Learn more at uh1.com.
After waiting for 2 months in northern Mexico, General Taylor finally decided to march toward the interior of the country and strike Monterey. Despite his growing concern over the methods of some of the Texas Rangers, he couldn't deny that they were excellent horsemen and fearless fighters. Just before the Army began to move on Monterey, the Texas Democrat in Austin printed a line that would become famous in Ranger lore. It read, "A Texas Ranger can ride like a Mexican, trail like an Indian, shoot like a Tennessean, and fight like the devil." General Taylor once again put the Rangers out front and told them to scout the road to Monterey. And on September 14th, 1846, they made first contact. Ben McCullough's company exchanged gunfire on the road with 200 Mexican troops. Both sides withdrew, but now the Mexican army was fully aware that Taylor was marching on Monterey. The Mexican army fortified its defenses around the city. If the Americans wanted it, they would have to fight through a series of obstacles to take it. A week after first contact, the army arrived on the outskirts of the city. Monterey sits at the base of some small mountains, which meant one side was completely cut off for attack or retreat. Taylor's plan called for a pincer move that would cut off the other avenues of escape and trap the Mexican army in the city. The Americans came in from the northeast, and Taylor sent part of his army to the west with General William Worth. They would swing around the city and come down from the hills while also blocking the road out of town to cut off supplies and reinforcements. Then Taylor would come down from the north and east, and the two armies would collapse on the town from all sides and crush the Mexican force. Jack Hayes and his Ranger regiments went west with General Worth. They scouted the area and determined that two hills were vulnerable, and if they could be taken, they would be perfect staging grounds for the main assault. The Battle of Monterey began at 6 a.m., September 21st, 1846. The night before the assault was wet and miserable. It rained all night, and the Rangers had little shelter and little food. The next morning, they were probably edgy and spoiling for a fight. In the mist of the early dawn, General Taylor's forces attacked the roads northeast of town and started to drive its defenders back into the city. To the west, the Army and the Rangers assaulted the first of the two hills, called Loma de Federación. 300 Rangers and artillerymen joined 5 companies of infantry and the Louisiana Volunteers in charging up the hill. There was a small garrison on the top that operated 2 cannons. The Mexicans poured rifle fire on the Americans. The cannons roared to life and showered the brush with grape shot. But the Americans had overwhelming force. The Rangers and the soldiers fought their way up the hill, screaming like furies, to take the first cannon. They spun it around and fired it at the second cannon. Then they rushed at the small garrison and crashed through its defenses. The Mexican defenders fled the garrison and retreated to an abandoned bishop's palace at the base of the hill. With their work done on the first day, the Rangers rested. And then the rains came back, and they spent another wet, miserable night in the hills west of Monterey. The next morning, they had the grueling task of assaulting the second hill, Loma de Independencia. It was much more steep and more heavily defended than the first hill, but the Americans were determined to take it. Again, the regiment under Jack Hayes, with Walker, McCullough, Gillespie, and Big Foot Wallace, teamed up with the regular army to scale the heights. And again, the Mexican garrison at the top of the hill poured fire down on the Americans. The Americans climbed 350 to 400 yards up the hill through a hail of gunfire, and the last 20 yards were nearly vertical. The Mexicans had created barriers with sandbags at the top of the hill, and the Americans had to fight their way through the breastworks to attack the garrison. The Rangers and the Army regulars stormed the garrison and forced its defenders to retreat down the hill to the abandoned Bishop's Palace. The victory was hard-fought and barely won, but not without great cost. Long-time Texas Ranger Robert Addison Gillespie was shot in the stomach and killed. At the end of the war, the Texas legislature carved out a new county from Behar and Travis counties and named it after Gillespie. That county is home to the famous Texas towns of Fredericksburg and Lukenbach. After Gillespie's death, Bigfoot Wallace took command of his company for the assault on the Bishop's Palace at the base of the
Bigfoot
hills.
Wallace. Never heard of
The
him.
abandoned palace was the last obstacle
Until now.
before the Western Army could strike into the heart of Monterey. At noon, General Worth ordered an attack on the palace. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Americans had captured the building. The Mexican soldiers who weren't killed or captured fled back into Monterey. The west side of the city was secure, and the main assault began the next day. On September 23rd, 1846, General Taylor and his force moved in from the east. General Worth and his force, which included the Rangers, moved in from the west. What followed was one of the early examples of true urban combat fought by an American army. On the west side, the army moved out of the Bishop's Palace and began the trek to the plaza in the center of the city. They had to advance 3 miles down 2 parallel roads. Jack Hayes and his companies, which included those of Ben McCullough and Bigfoot Wallace, moved down the road on the right. Samuel Walker led his Rangers down the road on the left. The regular army troops split into 2 groups and joined the Rangers in a literal street fight. The Americans' flying artillery rumbled down the paved roads. They launched cannonballs and grape shot from both sides of the street. The missiles crashed into homes and businesses. They shattered walls and obliterated wood posts. Rifle fire from all directions flooded the narrow lanes. Musket balls smashed into walls and tore through soldiers. Terrified screams rose up from the streets.
To the head.
The Rangers
That's
kicked
dry.
down doors and used their Patterson Colt pistols in close quarters battle. They grabbed hammers and pickaxes and battered holes in walls so they could move from room to room and house to house without going out into the killing zones of the streets. They found ladders and climbed onto rooftops where they could pour fire down onto the retreating Mexican soldiers. Block by block, they fought nearly 3 miles to the central plaza. By nightfall, they were 1 block from the enemy's last defenses. As darkness fell over the smoldering city, the Rangers and the soldiers rested and readied themselves for the final push the following morning. But it never came. The Mexican troops raised the white flag, and General Taylor accepted their surrender at noon the following day. Taylor agreed to a ceasefire for 8 weeks, which disgusted the Rangers and even President Polk. The Rangers and the President believed Mexico was not yet vanquished and the war needed to continue. In the aftermath, one regular army soldier reported that the Rangers essentially laid waste to parts of the city. They burned homes and killed as many as 100 people. Taylor, as he would be for the entire war, was caught between a rock and a hard place when it came to the Rangers. He had to praise them for helping him win a victory, but he was also furious at their lawlessness. A lieutenant in the 1st Infantry said, "The Mexicans fear the Texans more than they do the devil, and they have good reason for it." The Rangers' enlistments ended 10 days after the battle, and Taylor was only too happy to send them home. and they were happy to leave if Taylor planned to quit the fight before it had barely begun. As the Rangers prepared to leave Mexico, General William Worth, their commander, gave them a special send-off. He certainly did not like the things they had done after the battle, but he also would not have been standing in the central plaza of Monterey without them. He ordered the Ranger regiments to form up in front of his quarters. One by one, he invited each man inside and gave him a handshake and a little celebratory wine. When every man had passed through, the Rangers gave General Worth 3 cheers in appreciation. In his after-action report, he thanked Hayes, Walker, and McCullough by name. And on October 2nd, 1846, the Rangers began the trip back to Texas. A major from Ohio noted wryly that it was a long way back home. He said, "We saw them turn their faces
let's see how that turns out. In a few minutes, it'll dry pretty damn quickly.
in the hope that all honest Mexicans were at a safe distance from their path." With that, the Rangers' work in Mexico was done, at least for now.
Oh.
When the Rangers returned to the U.S., they were greeted with a hero's welcome. Most returned to Texas, but Samuel Walker took the opportunity to travel back east. He visited Washington, D.C., and then made a fateful trip to New York City. He met with
Yeah, I can
Samuel
see the
Colt
difference.
and
It's
told the
different.
down-on-his-luck
It's way
inventor
different.
how much he and the Rangers loved the Patterson Colt. But, Walker said, it could use a few improvements. And, as it turned out, the war with Mexico was nowhere near over. In the new year, the Rangers reassembled to return to the fighting. And this time, they would go all the way to Mexico City. The end of the Mexican-American War is next time on the Legends of the Old West podcast. This season was edited and mixed by Michael Martin at Sneaky Big Studios in Phoenix, Arizona. The theme song, Yellow Rose of Texas, was arranged and recorded by the Mighty Orc in Houston, Texas.
I might do one more
Much of the
round
music for this show was
of
produced
blood
by
red
Rob Valier
speed
in
paint.
Phoenix. And a very special
As you can
thank
see
to
where I
Matt
put it on the
Lowry in Ireland
chest,
for producing color
the
images
color it
of
did.
these famous Texas Rangers for the first time. Matt is a world-renowned photographer whose project My Colorful Past breathes new life into old photos. Check out his Facebook page for more of his work. And, as always, thank you for listening.
But
If you
I'm going to
enjoyed
take
the
a
show,
quick
please give
breather.
it a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. You can check out our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, for more
I
details.
just wasted some
and
white
follow
paint,
us on
but
social
that's what
media
it is.
for
What it
news
is.
of the show. Our Facebook page is Legends of the Old West Podcast, and our handles on Twitter and Instagram are at Old West Podcast. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.
You know when your eyes are bothering you? They feel like a mix of stressed, dry, and sandpaper. Let's call it stry paper. Not a word, but you get it. And so does BioTrue. BioTrue Hydration Boost Eye Drops provide instant moisture for eyes like yours. Plus, they contain an electrolyte, antioxidant, hyaluronic, and no preservatives. Naturally inspired ingredients that you can feel good about. So next time your eyes get that stry paper feeling, try BioTrue Eye Drops. Hi, I'm Michelle, and I'm a licensed dermatology provider with Curology. And the single best thing you can do for your skin is I have no idea. You can't see your face, assuming you have a face, and that's the entire point of Curology. You talk to a provider like me, who then prescribes you a custom skincare formula delivered to your door, which you can do right now at Curology.com, assuming you also have hands. Curology, skincare with a face, subject to provider consultation.
The Mexican-American War was a defining moment for the Texas Rangers. Men who were already household names in Texas became household names across the country. They would meet with presidents and be celebrated from New York City to San Francisco. The war also caused great change within the Rangers. It represented the changing of the guard, the passing of the torch. After the war, one captain would finish his career and ride west into the sunset. One would leave Texas in search of fortune, only only to return with frustration. And a new captain would rise to take command of all the Rangers. But the fighting in Mexico would take its toll. One of the most prominent Rangers, a man whose insights would have a dramatic impact on the American West, would not survive the war. From Black Barrel Media, this is Season 5 of the Legends of the Old West podcast, presented by the Cowboy Lifestyle Network. Here's Episode 3 of the Texas Rangers, War and the Walker Colt.
Some say a rising tide lifts all boats. The truth is, the tide has left many people behind. And while most simply comment, share a few links, and move on, students at Alliant International University prefer to act, pursuing graduate degrees under dedicated professors and faculty, alongside others who believe in equity, inclusivity, and social justice. Let's challenge the culture of complacency and start to succeed on purpose. Learn more at alliant.edu/purpose.
From the award-winning team behind Brand Dishonored comes the new captivating and immersive video game Redfall, an open-world single-player and co-op first-person shooter. Redfall explores the mystery behind a New England island under siege by vampires. Choose your hero and take the fight to the vampires, their cultist followers, and powerful vampire gods. Redfall launches May 2nd on Xbox, Game Pass, and PC. Pre-order it now or play day one with Game Pass. Rated M for mature.
After General Zachary Taylor signed an unpopular 8-week armistice with Mexico in September 1846, the Texas Rangers drifted home. They received joyous welcomes from New Orleans to San Antonio, but their days were not spent entirely in celebration. There was sadness and mourning, too. In October, Samuel Walker attended a ceremony to memorialize his good friend Robert Addison Gillespie. Gillespie had fallen at the Battle of Monterey, and now Walker asked the Assembly to draft resolutions to honor the longtime Ranger. The resolutions would be sent to Gillespie's relatives and all the newspapers in Texas. After paying tribute to his friend, Walker traveled east to Washington, D.C. at the request of President James K. Polk. He met with the president and various Army officials.
All right, one more quote of Speed Paint, and then I think I'll be.
December 2nd, 1846, he traveled to New York City and met gun manufacturer Samuel Colt. Colt had been scraping by the last few years, but now he was hopeful he could sell a big batch of his pistols to the U.S. Army for use in Mexico. President Polk had secured a declaration of war on Mexico from the U.S. Congress, and 50,000 troops were mobilizing. Colt wanted to secure a contract with the government to provide many of those troops with his pistols. But there was a problem. The Army's chief of ordnance didn't like them. During the meeting, Walker told Colt about the Rangers' fight at Walker's Creek 2 years earlier. The Rangers had won, in large part, because of the Patterson Colt. Walker was a true believer in the weapon, but he said it could be a little better. It needed to fire a larger round, which meant it needed to be bigger and heavier with a longer barrel. The additional size and weight could also have a secondary use. Once it was empty, it could be used as a club if necessary. 30 years in the future, wielding newer models of the gun, lawmen like Wyatt Earp would use the pistol as a club as their primary option when dealing with rowdies. In cowtowns like Dodge City, Earp used gunplay as a last resort. His first choice was to club a drunken cowboy over the head and let him sleep it off in jail, and he called the practice buffaloing. Or if you were a Texas Ranger and you were frustrated with dawdling service in a San Antonio saloon, you could use the gun to whack a surly bartender. It was versatile that way. After the meeting, Walker used his connections to President Polk and the Secretary of War to help Colt secure an order of 1,000 pistols for the U.S. Army. Colt was so thrilled by the order that he named the new model after Walker, and the Colt Walker pistol was born. The famous Army Colt and the Navy Colt and all the other long-barreled Colts that were to come owe their existence to the Colt Walker 1847 model. Now, I grew up calling it the Walker Colt, which is a common name for the gun, but if you think about it, they probably called it the Colt Walker back then if they used those words at all. I imagine this is similar to how we refer to cars today. The name of the maker comes first, the name of the model comes second. We call the Ford Explorer the Ford Explorer, not the Explorer Ford. Either way, the heavy, long-barreled, 6-chambered handgun set the standard, and it assured places in history for Colt and Walker.
Yeah,
While Walker was busy
I rest the bottom of the
things like unknowingly
model on the
revolutionizing the
palm of my
firearms
hand
industry,
because there's no
the
painting
Mexican-American
underneath there.
War was heating back up in the West. President Polk had dispatched General Winfield Scott to Mexico to finish the work started by General Taylor.
It's gonna come out pretty damn good.
Scott's plan was to sail his army to Veracruz on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and then march east to Mexico City and capture the capital. Taylor was supposed to rendezvous with Scott at Veracruz, which meant he had a long march ahead of him, which meant he needed his scouts back. In December 1846, not long after Walker met Colt in New York, General Taylor asked Ben McCullough and the Texas Rangers to return to Mexico to scout for his army. Just a month later, McCullough and 27 Rangers reunited with their old comrades in Taylor's army at Saltillo, a few miles southwest of Monterrey. Taylor immediately put the Rangers to work. He needed them to scout 30 miles of roads south of Saltillo. On the scout, McCullough's men had 3 quick skirmishes with Mexican soldiers, a couple of whom were deserting from the army. After interrogating them, McCullough began to get worried. He was starting to suspect that a decent-sized force was somewhere ahead of him. What he didn't know was that Santa Anna himself was closing in with 15,000 soldiers. On a cold February night in 1847, Ben McCullough and the Rangers reined in their horses on a path high in the hills south of Saltillo. McCullough dismounted and gazed at the scene below him through his spyglass. The Mexican deserter he had interrogated had told the truth. Santa Anna was marching north with a huge army. McCullough stared down at a camp that he thought was at least a mile long. Hundreds of campfires burned near tents that held thousands of soldiers. McCullough sent all but one of his company back up the road to warn Taylor. McCullough and his lieutenant stayed at the lookout spot, 5 miles from the Mexican camp, and waited until dawn. As the sun rose, McCullough again spied the camp through his scope. Bugles and drums erupted in the camp to wake up the soldiers. Men crawled out of their tents, rekindled their fires, and began cooking breakfast. The Rangers waited long enough for McCullough to estimate the enemy's strength at roughly 15,000 men.
Jeez.
Then they raced back to Taylor's camp. As the Rangers galloped toward headquarters, they could see a column of dust rising in the distance. The army was on the move. McCullough's men had reached Taylor in the night and given him the early report. Taylor was moving his army to a safer spot, but he himself had waited in camp for McCullough. McCullough told Taylor about the size of the army that was moving toward him, and that it was under the direction of Santa Anna himself, no less. The Mexican force would be here tomorrow, McCullough reported. Taylor and the Rangers joined the rest of the army in falling back to a pass between mountain ranges called Buena Vista. The bloodiest battle of the war happened 2 days later. The two armies sized each other up on February 22nd, 1847. Santa Anna had the numerical advantage. He had somewhere around 15,000 troops, and Taylor had somewhere around 5,000. Santa Anna, with his usual arrogance, tried to convince the Americans that it was pointless to fight. He sent a note under a flag of truce to General Taylor. It read, "You are surrounded by 20,000 men and cannot, in any human probability, avoid suffering a rout and being cut to pieces with your men. But as you deserve consideration and particular esteem, I wish to save you from a catastrophe and for that purpose, give you this notice in order that you may surrender at your discretion. Legend has it, Taylor replied by saying, "You can tell him to go to hell." That afternoon, the Mexicans tested the left side of the American army. The Americans held, but it was just a skirmish compared to the fighting the next day. The Mexican assault began early the next morning. Santa Anna's soldiers drove hard into volunteers from Arkansas and Kentucky. The Americans fell back in confusion. A unit from Indiana hurried up to the line to help, but they were pushed back also. The Mexican cavalry stormed through the hole in the line. They began to march around the left flank of the American force, but they were met by a unit from Mississippi and the Texas Rangers. The Americans sliced into the Mexican troops and cut off part of the advance. But many of the Mexican horsemen were already beyond the Americans. The Mexicans charged toward the Americans' base of supply near Hacienda Buena Vista. The Americans' wagons were protected by wagoneers and infantry, and now the guns of those soldiers exploded into the faces of the oncoming Mexicans. The Rangers and the American troops were in hot pursuit of the Mexican cavalry. The men guarding the wagons repulsed the Mexican charge, and then the Rangers and the Dragoons rushed up from behind and routed the cavalry. Meanwhile, back on the battlefield, the unit from Mississippi was in a pitched battle with a sizable number of Santa Anna's men. The Mississippians had plugged the hole in the line, but then Santa Anna sent another force around the extreme left flank of the American line. The men from Mississippi pivoted and engaged the Mexicans on the flank. The U.S. flying artillery rushed around to support the troops. Together, they pounded the Mexicans until Santa Anna's men were forced to withdraw. As night fell, all the hot spots on the battlefield grew quiet, except for the agonizing moans of the wounded on both sides. The Americans suffered 267 killed and 468 wounded. The Mexican casualties were 591 killed, 1,048 wounded. It turned out to be the bloodiest battle of the war, the second phase of which was just beginning. But it was a decisive American victory. And Taylor
I
gave
hear
enormous
fireworks
credit to
going
Major
off. I
Ben
think that's
McCullough.
from
It was his scouting mission that had alerted Taylor to the size
the
and position
racetrack.
of the Mexican army, which helped him choose a safer battlefield. And Taylor gave credit to the heroic efforts of the unit from Mississippi and its colonel, Jefferson Davis. The Battle of Buena Vista made Davis. In 6 years, he would be Secretary of War. In 10, he would be a senator. In 14, he would be the President of the Confederate States of America. But despite the praise heaped on Ben McCullough, this was the end of his war in Mexico, though he didn't know it yet. In early March 1847, about 2 weeks after the Battle of Buena Vista, McCullough returned to Texas to buy fresh horses and recruit more men. While he was gone, General Taylor made his final decision on the Rangers. He wrote, "The mounted men from Texas have scarcely made one expedition without unwarrantedly killing a Mexican. The constant recurrence of such atrocities is my motive for requesting that no more troops be sent to this column from the state of Texas." Taylor's words were probably true, but they were also a broad, sweeping generalization. As the commanding general, he had not witnessed any of these atrocities firsthand. He was working from reports that came in from all kinds of sources. And very few, if any, of his regular army soldiers and officers had ever experienced the brutality of fighting on the Texas frontier, or during the Texas Revolution. The Comanches regularly butchered combatants and non-combatants alike in horrifying ways. The Mexican army under Santa Anna famously offered no quarter to Texans during the Revolution. Santa Anna considered them criminals and pirates, not soldiers. He had hundreds executed at the Alamo and Goliad after they surrendered. So while there were certainly a few bad eggs in the Texas regiment, which there will always be in every army. It's probably not accurate to assume that the Rangers were just marauding through the countryside, killing at will when they weren't fighting battles. Either way, they did earn the nickname Texas Devils while they were in Mexico, and General Taylor sent them home. So McCullough's war came to an abrupt end, but Jack Hayes' war was about to resume. While McCullough was in Texas on his recruiting mission, Hayes was in Washington meeting with President Polk. He secured an enlistment of 1 year for new companies of Rangers. They would have two goals: protect the Texas frontier and help General Winfield Scott as he marched to Mexico City. Peter Hansborough Bell was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the Ranger companies on the Texas frontier in the spring of 1847. The companies returning from Taylor's army now fell under his guidance, and 3 of his captains were Ben McCullough, Henry McCullough, and Bigfoot Wallace. While these men protected the state, Jack Hayes and Samuel Walker went south to fight for the nation. General Winfield Scott's mission was fairly direct. He was supposed to sail to the port city of Veracruz on the Gulf Coast and then march almost straight east to capture Mexico City. But that was a distance of about 400 kilometers, or 250 miles. He needed the Texas Rangers to scout the roads and protect his supply lines from bandits and guerrilla fighters. Walker arrived with 182 Rangers in May and joined Scott's army, and they began their march to Mexico City. Walker's company of Rangers clashed with the enemy almost immediately. The Rangers fought skirmishes at villages along the road, and they steadily drove the Mexicans from the path of the army. By the end of May, the Americans had reached a point on the road where it was time for Walker's Rangers to stay behind and guard the supply lines. General Scott continued his march east to Mexico City, and Walker began to stalk the hills for bandits. Walker's company now fell under the command of Colonel Francis Murray Wynkoop, whose younger brother Edward would end up investigating the Sand Creek Massacre 18 years from now. Walker and Wynkoop did not get along, and their rocky relationship only declined over the summer. In August, Walker spotted a unit of Mexican cavalry in the hills. There was a brief fight, but then the cavalry fled before Wynkoop's men arrived. Wynkoop was worried about being cut off, and he ordered Walker and the Rangers to retreat to a safer location. Walker disobeyed, and later that day, the whole unit got into a fierce fight with 500 Mexican soldiers. Walker and his 50 men held off the Mexicans until Wynkoop's infantry rushed forward to help. Together, they pushed the Mexicans back. As the Mexicans fled, another American unit joined the fight, and they all drove the Mexicans through the hills for 2 miles before they disengaged. The fight began the deep rift between Walker and Wynkoop. Walker accused Wynkoop of cowardice for wanting to retreat. Wynkoop chastised Walker for disobeying an order. A month later, Wynkoop instructed Walker to charge the first of 2 villages on the road. Walker saw no threat from the village and refused to expend the energy on a charge that wasn't necessary. Wynkoop was furious at Walker for disobeying another order. Walker was outraged by Wynkoop's willingness to let his soldiers plunder the towns and villages they passed. The 2 men got into a heated argument that was about to turn violent before they were separated by their men. Wynkoop ordered Walker and his company to return to the castle that was being used as their headquarters, and at that point, Walker's company was given to another man, and Walker was confined to his quarters. And while Walker and Wynkoop quarreled on the mountain roads near Veracruz, General Scott threatened the capital city and began the final phase of the war.
Alright, it's about that time to
Whether you're searching for the
call
latest
Blood
sneaker drop,
Red.
an iconic handbag,
The Red's
a
a
timeless watch, or
Dunsky.
your next piece of classic jewelry, eBay
But so far I'm pretty happy with the way it's turned out.
With years of experience, they're making sure the piece you're searching for is worthy of your collection. eBay's authenticators are experts in their craft, true connoisseurs, and as leaders in their fields, they're making
sure your items always arrive as authentic as your style. In a world full of fakes, it's time to get real with eBay Authenticity Guarantee. Everyone deserves real. Visit ebay.com for terms.
NetJets, the worldwide private aviation leader, is known for exceptional service, for personalizing every detail and elevating every flight. Because NetJets standard is not just to meet their definition of perfection, it's to exceed yours. All by providing the custom, curated luxury experiences you deserve. Explore NetJets premium travel solutions at netjets.com.
As Walker and Wynkoop protected his supply lines, General Scott marched toward Mexico City in the summer of 1847. On September 13th, right around the time Walker and Wynkoop had their falling out, Scott attacked Mexico City. By the 14th, he had pushed Santa Anna out of the capital, and Mexico City had fallen. It was the last major battle of the war, but the fighting was certainly not done. Santa Anna and his army had been beaten, but not destroyed. They fled Mexico City and joined the siege of an American stronghold at Puebla, southeast of the capital. During that time, General Joseph Lane had arrived in Mexico with reinforcements, and as he marched from Veracruz to Puebla to help break the siege, he stopped at the Rangers' headquarters to rest. He promptly released Walker from confinement and instructed the captain to add his Rangers to the reinforcements. Together, they would all ride to Puebla and effectively end the war. But just before they left, Lane learned from a spy that Santa Anna might be in a town called Huamantla, north of Puebla. That would put him just 50 miles from where Lane and Walker now stood. The general quickly marched 1,800 men and 5 cannons toward the town. Walker and 200 men led the advance party. On the afternoon of October 9th, 1847, Walker and his troops approached the outskirts of Huamantla. They lined up in columns of 4 and drew their sabers. Then they thundered into the town plaza and charged 500 Mexican soldiers.
Finishing off with
Steel
this
clashed
right
with steel as the Rangers swung their swords and the Mexicans stabbed with their lances. Walker decapitated a Mexican officer with his blade before drawing his Colt Walker pistols. The furious charge scattered the Mexican soldiers, and the Americans began plundering the town, thinking the fighting was done. But 2 miles away, Santa Anna watched the battle from a church tower. He rallied perhaps 2,000 soldiers to advance on the town. He screamed into the plaza with 500 men, and a new battle raged in close quarters. Horsemen galloped at each other in the streets, striking with swords and pistols. The battle surged back and forth until the Americans began to drive the Mexicans back. Walker had pistols in both hands, the guns that were personal gifts from Samuel Colt and that bore his name. He blasted away with the heavy weapons, but then he suddenly reeled in the saddle. He crashed to the ground as a rifle slug from a sniper found its mark. As he lay bleeding in the street, he told his men to keep fighting. The infantry would be here soon. Just a few moments later, General Lane's infantry engulfed the town and drove the Mexican force from the streets.
Look at that.
When it was done, it proved to be the end of Santa Anna's military career. 3 days later, Lane's men marched to Puebla and broke the siege. The Americans had won 2 more victories, but the emotional cost was severe. Samuel Walker died on the streets of Huamantla.
It's starting to
General
look
Lane was
good.
the first of many to express words of extreme sorrow.
Next is silver, and then last gold.
In his after-action report, he wrote, "The victory is saddened by the loss of one of the most chivalric, noble-hearted men that graced the profession at arms, Captain Samuel H. Walker of the Mounted Riflemen. Foremost in the advance, he routed the enemy when he fell mortally wounded. In his death, the service has met with a loss that cannot easily be repaired. Walker was initially buried in Mexico. His old enemy in the army, Colonel Wincoop, regretted that he had not been able to make amends with Walker before the captain died. Wincoop conducted the funeral at Walker's burial in Mexico. A month later, Walker's body was exhumed and brought back to Texas. He was buried in San Antonio's Old City Cemetery in 1848, but then disinterred again 8 years later. In 1856, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Battle of San Jacinto, he was reburied at Oddfellow Cemetery in San Antonio. His wish was to be buried alongside his old friend, Robert Addison Gillespie, and the Texans granted that wish. Today, the cemetery is called Alamo Masonic Cemetery, and monuments to Walker and Gillespie, and defenders of the Alamo, are still there. John Salmon Ford knew he needed a change. He had been a doctor during the Texas Revolution, and a politician during the waning days of the Republic. And now he was a newspaper publisher in Austin. His paper, the Texas Democrat, gave us several great quotes about the Texas Rangers. But in early 1847, Ford was heartbroken and depressed. The previous summer, he had nursed his new wife through tuberculosis, but she had lost the fight. With her gone, he needed to get out of Austin. So he rode to San Antonio and enlisted in the Texas Rangers. Jack Hayes was recruiting men to return to Mexico, and Ford signed up. He quickly became Hayes' adjutant. In October, shortly after the devastating news of the death of Samuel Walker, Hayes and Ford and a new Ranger regiment sailed from Texas to Veracruz to help the U.S. Army finish the war with Mexico. The major battles were done. Santa Anna's army had been vanquished, but the general was still on the loose. A peace treaty had not been signed, and there were still thousands of renegades prowling the hills between Veracruz and Mexico City. It was the job of Hayes and the Rangers to clean them out, a task they were all too familiar with. Once the Rangers were assembled in Veracruz, their first order of business was to make sure they were properly armed. Hayes requisitioned 394 Colt Walker pistols from the supply depot. Once the Rangers were equipped, they set off for Mexico City. In November, they helped Samuel Walker's former commander, General Lane, on a rescue mission south of Puebla, the city that had been under siege when Walker died.
Oh crap.
Over 2 days, the combined force of Army and Rangers fought hundreds of Mexican troops and liberated 21 American prisoners from a Mexican garrison, as well as capturing a huge store of weapons and ammunition. In early December, Jack Hayes led the Rangers into Mexico City, which had been
Alright, I gotta change my
General
brush.
Scott for almost 2 months. The presence of the Rangers was noted by everyone, friend and foe alike. General Ethan Allen Hitchcock wrote, "Hayes Rangers have come, their appearance never to be forgotten. Not in any sort of uniform, but well mounted and doubly armed. Each man has 1 or 2 Colt revolvers, besides ordinary pistols, a sword, and every man his rifle. The Mexicans are terribly afraid of them." The fear was tangible, and it caused bloodshed on both sides. As Hayes led the Rangers into Mexico City, a bandit threw a rock and knocked Hayes' cap off his head. A Ranger pulled his Colt, fired at the bandit, and killed the man with a headshot. In short order, a Ranger killed another Mexican citizen, and General Scott ordered Colonel Hayes to account for the killings. Hayes was directed to the point. He told Scott that yes, his men had killed 2 people upon entering the city. But the Rangers, said Hayes, were not accustomed to being insulted without resenting it. Scott was impressed by Hayes' forthright manner and allowed the Ranger to explain the situation. Hayes gave Scott a brief history of the years of bloody resentment between the 2 cultures. Scott took no action against Hayes or the Rangers. The same month Hayes entered Mexico City, Texas elected a new governor. He was the first of many former Rangers to hold office. He was George Wood, the commander of the 2nd Regiment of Texas Mounted Volunteers at the beginning of the war. The regiment made up of Rangers from East Texas. In national politics, a freshman congressman of the old line.
I know I'm probably messing this up,
but not the way he would have liked. He and some other
I'm getting it
legislators
as close as
questioned
humanly
the dubious
possible.
origins of the Mexican War. The border between Texas and Mexico had always been disputed, and he questioned the spot on which American blood had been shed. Was it really American soil, he asked. 3 days before Christmas 1847, he introduced the Spot Resolutions, and the bill earned him a derisive nickname. That congressman was 37-year-old Abraham Lincoln, and a newspaper in his adopted state of Illinois began to call him Spotty Lincoln. In the new year of 1848, Jack Hayes and the Rangers went to work hunting down bandits who harassed American troops. In late January, Hayes and General Lane nearly captured the man himself, Santa Anna, but the general received a warning just 2 hours before the arrival of the Americans, and he escaped. Hayes and the Rangers fought engagements almost continuously throughout January and February, despite the peace treaty that was finally signed on February 2nd. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo officially ended hostilities between Mexico and the United States. But while American soldiers were on Mexican soil, it wasn't easy to enforce. In Mexico City, Americans were murdered on a nightly basis, which of course prompted retaliation. On February 13th, a ranger disappeared in the most violent quarter of the city, an area known as Cutthroat. The man's company found his body the next day. When night fell, they raged through the streets. It was said there were 80 fresh bodies in the city morgue come morning. 12 days later, February 25th, 1848, Hayes, Ford, and the Rangers fought in the final bloody engagement of the war.
This ain't gonna be pretty.
Ford had been terribly sick on the campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City and had missed most of the fighting. But now, he acquitted himself valiantly. He killed at least 4 Mexican soldiers by himself in the last action of the war. 3 weeks later, the Rangers packed up and began the trip to Veracruz. Their service was done. On April 29th, 1848, the Texas Rangers mustered out of federal service, feeling that they had avenged the massacres of their countrymen at Goliad and the Alamo. Hayes and Ford were the last 2 to leave. They had many
See, right
reports
here
to
is
write,
all silver.
but after they were done with the paperwork, they too
You know, a
sailed
lot of
for
it is
home.
gonna be gold.
On May 20th, 1848, the city of San Antonio threw a grand ball for its returning hero and favorite son, John Coffee Hayes. Hayes had been given his first command just 7 years earlier. In those 7 years, he had led the effort to elevate the Rangers with diligent training,
Jeez,
new tactics,
all this
and
is
new
from printer
weapons.
mess up.
Under his leadership, and with the assistance of captains like Samuel Walker, Robert Gillespie, the McCullough brothers, Peter Bell, Bigfoot Wallace, and many others, the Texas Rangers had become a feared fighting force with international fame. Yes, they might have been quick to the trigger at times, but they were products of their environment. There was no place like Texas.
I'm gonna stop right here because right
In the
here is
wake of the
gold.
Mexican-American War,
Yeah.
many things in Texas changed, and many things stayed the same. 2 celebrated commanders left the Rangers, but others rose in their places. For many Texans, the focus had never left the threat of the Comanches on the frontier, but now that the war was over, the U.S. government joined in the effort to protect the settlements. The U.S. Army quickly discovered it knew nothing about fighting Comanches, and it begrudgingly called on the Rangers for help. To lead the Rangers in this new era was a new commander, John Salmon Ford. Those stories are next time on the Legends of the Old West podcast. The theme song, Yellow Rose of Texas, was arranged and recorded by the Mighty Orc in Houston, Texas. Much of the music for this show was produced by Rob Valier in Phoenix. And a very special thank you to Matt Lowry in Ireland for producing color images of these famous Texas Rangers for the first time. Matt is a world-renowned photographer whose project My Colorful Past breathes new life into old photos. Check out his Facebook page for more of his work. And, as always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. You can check out our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, for more details, and follow us on social media for news of the show. Our Facebook page is Legends of the Old West Podcast, and our handles on Twitter and Instagram are at Old West Podcast. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.
This episode is brought to you by Cliff Kid, makers of Z-Bar. Parents, say goodbye to half-eaten snack bars abandoned for tasting like cardboard. And say hello to Cliff Kid Z-Bar Energy Snack Bars. With a mouth-watering, soft-baked texture and kid-favorite flavors like chocolate chip and iced oatmeal cookie, these organic whole grain bars have the taste kids love. Visit cliffkid.com to learn more. That's CLIF kid.com.
At FedEx Office, we know running a business is a marathon. But sometimes, every task feels like a sprint. Design the product catalog, pick up the new boxes, print the business cards, notarize the lease, put out 20 more yard signs. It's a lot. Luckily for you, FedEx Office is here to help turn your ideas into reality. So you can stop running yourself in circles and start concentrating on the important things, like deciding what's for lunch. Visit your nearest location or office.fedex.com to get started. FedEx Office.
Albert James Meyer was a surgeon with the U.S. Army who spent time on the Texas frontier in the mid-1850s. He was stationed at Fort Clark on the Pecos River, Fort Duncan on the Rio Grande, and Fort Davis in far west Texas. During this time, he had become fascinated by the Army's communication system, or lack thereof. One of the many challenges on the frontier was the ability of units to communicate with each other over long distances. The Army had tried several systems over the years, but they proved to be difficult and complicated. Meyer thought he had a better idea. It's easy to picture him standing outside the gates of Fort Davis in West Texas, scanning an endless horizon. The Chihuahuan Desert would be spread out before him, the Davis Mountains rising at his back. It would be hot during the day, glorious in the evening, and peaceful at night,
really good.
with the quiet broken only by the yip of a coyote or the howl of a wolf. As the gates of the fort swung open behind him, a patrol of soldiers on horseback would trot out. And these were not the cavalrymen we've seen in Western movies. The U.S. cavalry, as we think of it today, did not exist yet. These were infantrymen on horseback, and there was a big difference, as the Army would soon learn in Texas. Meyer would watch them ride off through the hills or across the barren flatlands and slowly recede in the distance. As he stood there with no telegraph communication, he envisioned a new system of messaging that would allow soldiers to stay in touch over long distances. It was a signal system that would use easily recognizable flags during the day and torches at night. As Meyer lingered at the base of the Davis Mountains in West Texas, maybe with the sun setting behind him and the coolness of the evening coming on, the idea of this new system solidified in his mind. He went on to create the U.S. Army Signal Corps, which began with his idea of using flags to communicate, then evolved to oversee telegraph communications, and radio, and telephonic communication, and now it supervises the complex worldwide communication network of the American military. And the Signal Corps can trace its origins, at least in part, back to Meyer's time in Texas. And of course, during the 2 years Meyer was in Texas, he came in contact with the Texas Rangers.
Oh, yeah.
Many years later, he wrote about one experience and said, "Now, don't picture to yourself the Ranger as you read of him in newspapers, the personification of the brave and the reckless wild, but perhaps with a redeeming trait of lofty chivalry. But let me describe the animal, and trust that you may have little to do with him. Take one of the lowest canal drivers, dress him in ragged clothes, put a rifle in his hand, a revolver and a big Bowie knife at his belt. Utterly eradicate any little trace of civilization or refinement, and you have the material for the Texas Mounted Ranger." As Meyer wrote, it's probably fair to say that not all Rangers were cut from the noble, gallant mold of John Coffee Hayes or Samuel Walker. But Meyer did qualify his statement a little at the end. He finished by saying, "There are exceptions. My invective is not meant for all."
Some say a rising tide lifts all boats. The truth is, the tide has left many people behind. And while most simply comment, share a few links, and move on, students at Alliant International University prefer to act, pursuing graduate degrees under dedicated professors and faculty, alongside others who believe in equity, inclusivity, and social justice. Let's challenge the culture of complacency and start to succeed on purpose. Learn more at alliant.edu/purpose.
When it comes to family vacations, nothing beats Florida. With 825 miles of beaches, 700 freshwater springs, and over 1,300 trails, there's something for every member of your family to enjoy. From mermaids to roller coasters. Make all your family's dreams come true. And with plenty of room to run and play, you can enjoy the great outdoors like never before. So what are you waiting for? Plan your vacation at visitflorida.com.
I love Florida. Florida's nice. Why
From
am I not
Black Barrel
living
Media,
there?
This is season 5 of
Because
the
I got a good
Legends of
job
the
here.
Old West podcast, presented by the Cowboy Lifestyle Network. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this is the 4th episode of a 5-part series on the Texas Rangers. Comanche Moon. At the close of the Mexican-American War, a transition took place in the Texas Rangers. 2 of the most prominent Rangers of the 1840s died in the fighting, Samuel Walker and Robert Gillespie. Another Ranger would only serve a couple more years, and 2 more were about to leave immediately. John Coffee Hayes returned to a hero's welcome in San Antonio when he finally finished his service in Mexico in May of 1848. The city threw him a grand ball, and he surely accepted the praise with the grace and modesty he was known for in civilian life. But his days as a Texas Ranger were now done. He resigned from the service and hoped his fighting days were behind him. He escorted a wagon train all the way to California and arrived at the peak of the gold rush. He moved to San Francisco and spent the rest of his life in Northern California. He was a county sheriff, a politician, and a businessman. And in 1860, he was called on to lead a volunteer militia against a band of Paiutes in Nevada. It was the final military action of Hayes' life, though he lived another 23 years. John Coffee Hayes passed away April 21st, 1883, and is buried in California. He only spent 11 of his 66 years in Texas, but he made as big a mark as anyone. Ben McCullough followed his old friend Jack Hayes out to California, but he didn't have as much success as Jack. He also arrived in 1849 and tried to strike it rich in the gold fields, but it didn't work out. He became sheriff of Sacramento County in 1850, at the same time Jack was also a sheriff in the area. So 2 famous Texas Rangers were on patrol in Northern California at the same time. But McCullough didn't like the job, and he returned to Texas in 1851. A couple years later, he was appointed a U.S. Marshal by President Franklin Pierce. But his story really comes back into focus in 1855, at a pivotal moment for the U.S. Army. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Bigfoot Wallace had fought in Peter Bell's ranging companies on the Texas frontier during the second stage of the Mexican-American War. But by the early 1850s, his time as an official ranger was winding down. He battled Apaches and Comanches in South Texas, and in the fall of 1850, we gained some valuable insight into the makeup of a ranger company. Wallace's unit had 88 men in total, and it was comprised of 11 Germans, 3 Irishmen, 1 Canadian, and 1 Scotsman. 11
Canada.
men were from Tennessee, 51 were from other southern states, and only 4 were from Texas. In 1851, Wallace had stumbled into a new trade. He became a stage driver for the U.S. Postal Service. He made regular trips from San Antonio to San Elizario on the Rio Grande, just south of El Paso. And even though he wasn't a ranger anymore, he still had to fight off plenty of attacks by Comanches and Apaches on his mail route. So while 3 well-known rangers finished their time in the service, another was just beginning for all intents and purposes. John Salmon Ford had fought with Jack Hayes in Mexico at the end of the war, and when he returned to Texas, he resumed his position as publisher of the Texas Democrat newspaper in Austin. But he quickly grew bored with the routine. In the spring of 1848, he joined Major Robert Neighbors on an expedition to scout a road from San Antonio to El Paso. He was easing back into a life of adventure, and those adventures would take him to the usual hotspots of chaos in Texas, the Nueces Strip, and the western frontier. While the war raged in Mexico in the second half of the 1840s, 3 forces were at work on the Texas frontier. The ranger companies under the command of Peter Bell, Major Robert Neighbors, who was named Indian Agent for Texas in 1845, and a peace commission led by the younger brother of famed explorer Meriwether Lewis. The peace commission began talks with the Texas tribes in 1846 and resulted in a treaty signed by the president in 1847. Between the treaty, the Rangers, and the work of Robert Neighbors, who was widely recognized as one of the few honest Indian agents, Comanche raids on the settlements were scarce for a couple years. But that all changed in the summer of 1849. That summer, epidemics of cholera and smallpox decimated the Comanches. The tribe had been largely free from disease because their homeland was so remote. But now, as white civilization encroached on Comanche lands, the white man's diseases burned through the Comanche camps like wildfire. Nearly all of the Comanche leaders were wiped out. It's estimated that as many as half the members of the Comanche tribe died as the diseases ravaged village after village. In the aftermath, the survivors became more remote and more hostile. They punished settlements on the northwest frontier and raided the southwest relentlessly, both out of hatred and starvation. For the next few years, at least 100 white settlers died at the hands of the Comanches each year. In the fall of 1849, an editorial appeared in the Texas State Gazette newspaper that stated plainly the thoughts on the minds of many Texans. It read, "The Indians must be pursued, hunted, run down, and killed. Killed until they find out we are in earnest." To that end, the U.S. Army came to Texas.
Oh. So with that,
after the Mexican-American War, Texans wanted to settle on the millions of acres of land that had been taken from Mexico. And the government of Texas badly wanted to sell those acres because, as always, it was in desperate need of money. But sales and settlements couldn't happen as long as the Comanches prowled the area. So the army came to Texas and began constructing forts in an arc along the western frontier to protect white settlements. The line of forts was anchored in the north by Fort Worth, and in the south by Fort Duncan on the Rio Grande, which became the present-day city of Eagle Pass. But as the army and the settlers immediately learned, there was a major problem with this arc of forts. They were too close to the settlements. By the time the soldiers in a fort could act on a Comanche raid, the Comanches were already past them and attacking the settlements. So in the early 1850s, the army pushed the line of forts farther west, and it was this line of forts that would become famous in Western lore and immortalized by Hollywood 100 years later. They had names like Fort Belknap, Fort Phantom Hill, Fort Clark, Fort Stockton, and Fort Davis. But while the army succeeded in moving its forts westward, it grappled with still more problems. The forts were too far apart. Comanche raiders could slip between them without being detected. They were understaffed, even though the army had dedicated 2,400 troops to the effort, which was a third of the entire force. 19 of the Army's 109 forts were in Texas. But the soldiers who were sent to the Texas frontier were often the lowest quality. And most of them were infantry, stationed out there on the vast Texas plains and expected to compete with the greatest horse soldiers in the world. And if the soldiers weren't infantry, they were dragoons.
The Comanche were the best? I thought the Lakota was.
The dragoons were the last
Those are
holdovers
horse
of a
people.
bygone era of military horsemen.
Then again,
They
any
had loud uniforms,
Native
heavy
American
equipment,
on a
and
horse
heavy
is saying
saddles,
well,
and
this
they
is
were
dangerous,
woefully
but
outmanned.
back
One
then,
Texas
yeah.
Ranger put it bluntly. The Indians were in no danger from the dragoons, unless their gaudy appearance and clumsy horsemanship caused them to laugh themselves to death. But help was on the way. The new Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, understood the need for change. He was about to create the first U.S. cavalry regiment with the express purpose of fighting on the Texas frontier. And Texas Ranger Ben McCullough badly wanted to lead it. Jefferson Davis, the hero of the Battle of Buena Vista, became Secretary of War in 1853. He successfully lobbied Congress to let him create 4 new units in the Army, 2 regiments of cavalry and 2 regiments of infantry. The 1st Regiment of Cavalry was supposed to be an elite unit specifically designed for work in Texas. Davis would hand-pick the officers. The soldiers would be armed with new breech-loading Springfield rifles and 36 caliber Navy Colt pistols. They would take 12-pound howitzers into the field. No expense would be spared to make this unit the best in the country, and Ben McCullough wanted to command it. He lobbied his influential friends to help him get the appointment. He enlisted Sam Houston, who was now one of 2 U.S. senators from Texas. He enlisted his old friend and former commander, Peter Hansborough Bell. Bell had commanded the ranger companies on the frontier during the Mexican War. Then he became governor after another former ranger, George Wood, left office. Now he was a U.S. congressman from Texas. McCullough had the support of both men, but the other senator from Texas favored a different candidate. The senator was Thomas Rusk, who had been the first Secretary of War for the Republic of Texas. He supported General Albert Sidney Johnston, who had been the Secretary of War under the second President of the Republic, Mirabeau Lamar. Johnson was a West Point graduate, and that likely tipped the scales in his favor. Davis gave him command of the unit, but he offered the position of second in command, Lieutenant Colonel, to McCullough. McCullough said he would have to consult with the legislators from Texas, Houston, Rusk, and Bell, and that sealed his fate. When he returned to Davis the next day to accept the offer, Davis told him it was no longer available. The position had been filled by a rising star in the Army, an engineer who had also made a name for himself in Mexico, Robert E. Lee. McCullough likely left dejected and angry. but he would eventually get his chance to command troops in battle. Jefferson Davis would give McCullough another opportunity 6 years in the future, though it would be in the Army of the Confederate States of America, not the United States. For now, Davis filled the ranks of the officers' corps with more West Point graduates. George Henry Thomas was a major. Thomas had been an instructor at West Point, as well as a graduate. Two of his students were John Bell Hood and Jeb Stuart, both of whom would become famous in the Confederate Army several years from now. In one of the many sad overlaps in the Civil War, Thomas, who fought for the Union, crushed Hood's army in Tennessee after the fall of Atlanta in 1864, and effectively ended the career of his former student. But at the moment, they were on the same team, and they were headed to Texas.
Oh, excuse me.
Throughout the early 1850s, while the Army built 2 lines of forts on the frontier and began to reorganize itself,
I'm gonna have to
Ranger
touch up with
Captains
something here.
Bigfoot Wallace and John Ford patrolled West Texas and the Nueces Strip. The Nueces Strip, the portion of southwest Texas between San Antonio and the Rio Grande River, remained a hotbed of lawlessness. No matter how many ranger patrols scoured the area, it seemed it was never enough. The area was just too big, and there were too many places to hide. But Ford and his men spent a year and a half in the sweltering South Texas heat and humidity as they battled every type of criminal known to man. And for a man who began his professional career as a doctor, a politician, and a newspaperman, he was proving to be a fierce fighter and a reliable commander. And it's time we start calling him by the name that is most commonly used in Texas Ranger tradition: Rip Ford. There are 3 main stories behind the nickname. First, and most widely known, is that he was given the name during the Mexican War. He was responsible for writing condolence letters to the families of fallen Rangers. He would end the letters by writing "Rest in Peace" at the bottom, and over time, he abbreviated the words R.I.P. It's a nice story, but it probably wasn't true to that extent. He did write "Rest in Peace" next to the names of fallen Rangers in reports and letters, so that's probably where the nickname comes from. But the image of Ford sitting in an army tent in the wilds of Mexico, scribbling letter after letter by candlelight to the point where he has to save time by using abbreviations, is probably not accurate. In reality, the Rangers suffered relatively few losses compared to the regular army, so Ford likely would not have spent long hours writing letters to families. A more humorous version is that he fell asleep on duty one time, and his men began calling him Old Rip, after Rip Van Winkle. And the third version states that he was so vicious while fighting his enemies, he used to rip into them. But whichever version you choose to believe, after the war, he was known as Rip Ford. So as Comanche raids ramped back up again after that terrible summer of 1849, Ford was in the thick of the fighting. At least until he left the Rangers for a couple years to become the mayor of Austin. He would return again at the end of the 1850s, when he fought in 2 big engagements that brought him major notoriety. But between now and then, the elite U.S. cavalry arrived on the scene.
National Geographic presents.
What I'm asking you to do is dangerous. You need to take your time to think it through.
No, I don't. What do I do? We can't save everyone. But if I don't try, I don't think I'll be able to live with myself. What are we supposed to do? Some stood by. Anything. You have to. She stood up. There has to be a line. Belle Powley is Meet Geese. There has to be me for this to work. A Small Light limited series premieres Monday, May 1st at 9. Stream on Hulu and Disney+.
Boost your savings and benefits at Ralph's with a free 30-day trial of a Boost by Ralph's Rewards. You'll get 2 times fuel points on groceries and merchandise in-store with pickup or delivery. Your fuel points add up as you shop, too, and you won't even have to drive to earn them. Plus, get free delivery on any order over $35. More savings, more benefits and all the things you need with Boost by Ralph's Rewards. A new level of membership has arrived. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at ralphs.com/boost. $35 order minimum. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
The volume of Comanche raids rose and fell from the 1840s through the mid-1850s. It fell during the Mexican War years, in part because of the ranger companies commanded by Peter Bell and captained by men like Ben McCullough, Henry McCullough, and Bigfoot Wallace, and in part because of a peace treaty that was signed in 1847. But after the awful summer of disease in 1849, the volume rose again and seemed to stay fairly steady through the early 1850s, even while the Army constructed 2 lines of forts to protect the western frontier. By 1851, Indian agent Robert Neighbors was pushing for reservations to be created in Texas. Many Texans were opposed to bringing the system to their state, but in 1854, the Texas Congress gave Neighbors what he wanted. 2 reservations were created on forks of the Brazos River near Fort Belknap. In February 1855, Neighbors moved bands of 5 tribes onto the reservations. But the experiment would be short-lived, and it did not bring peace. If anything, you could argue it created more problems. There was hostility toward the reservations and the people who lived on them. The people were continuously blamed for raids in the area, even though Neighbors vehemently defended them. And then the reservations themselves became targets for raids, since they had stockpiles of food that could be easily stolen.
There you go.
Most Comanches refused to live on the designated lands,
Let's
and
see.
they took their aggression out on the reservations as well
Okay.
as the white settlements.
There's
And
still
then
some
some.
gray left.
As Texas struggled
Well, I still
with
gotta
the
do
new
the back
reservation
anyway.
system, the nation's attention turned northward. Increasing violence on the plains shocked the country, and as events accumulated, they became known collectively as Bleeding Kansas. At the same time, the Rangers suffered a setback. A Ranger captain named James Callahan marched his company into Mexico to fight a band of Apaches. He ended up facing off with hundreds of Mexican troops and burned part of the town of Piedras Negras to the ground. The embarrassing and destructive mission forced the state of Texas to pay $50,000 in damages to the people of Piedras Negras. But things started to change in 1856 as the new elite cavalry regiment arrived on the Texas frontier. General Albert Sidney Johnston, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, Major George Thomas, Lieutenant John Bell Hood, and the rest of the men of the cavalry proved to be quick learners. They split their headquarters between Fort Mason and Fort Belknap and began patrolling the area. Their orders were simple. Engage any native person who was not on a reservation. Anyone not on a reservation was considered hostile. As the troops learned the terrain and the abilities of their horses as well as themselves, they began conducting longer and longer patrols. Soon, a patrol could last 30 days and cover 600 miles of territory. They became really good at fighting Comanches, and they fought almost continuously. The number of successful Comanche raids against settlements fell, and the cavalry actually brought to an end 100 years of Comanche raids into Mexico. By 1857, it was virtually impossible for any sizable Comanche force to make it all the way from their camps in northern Texas and Oklahoma to the Rio Grande River without getting intercepted by the cavalry. The cavalry had so much success that a predictable irony happened. They were sent away. For more than a year, the cavalry patrolled north-central Texas and reduced the number of Comanche raids on white settlements. But then the cavalry's benefactor, Jefferson Davis, left the office of Secretary of War. He became a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, and the new man in the War Office decided that Texas was now under control. He ordered most of the cavalry to go north to deal with growing violence around the Mormon community in Utah. General Johnston led most of his troops north, and Ben McCullough went with him to try to broker peace between the Mormons and the U.S. government. And as you probably guessed, when the army went away, the number of Comanche raids rose. The new Texas governor, Hardin Runnels, felt bombarded by the reports from the frontier of fresh Indian depredations, as they were often called. In January 1858, he pushed a bill through Congress that would pay for 4 companies of rangers, 100 men total, and he put John Rip Ford in command. In his official orders, Runnels wrote, "I impress upon you the necessity of action and energy. Follow any and all trails of hostile or suspected hostile Indians you may discover, and if possible, overtake and chastise them." It was a perfect example of an order from this time period. It was specific enough to get Ford to move, but vague enough to give him the leeway to basically do whatever he wanted. In essence, the order said, find Indians and kill them. What followed were 2 of the bloodiest years in Texas since the Revolution 50 years earlier. In March 1858, Rip Ford rode north out of Austin with 100 heavily armed men. Each ranger had a rifle and a pair of Colt pistols. A newspaper article said the unit could fire 1,500 rounds before any man had to reload. That was a serious amount of firepower, especially when used against people who still relied on bows and arrows to a large degree. And then, the size of his force doubled. When they reached the reservations on the Brazos, Ford enlisted Indian agent Shapley Ross. Ross recruited 113 warriors from the reservation who were eager to fight their ancient enemies, the Comanches. At the end of April, Ford, Ross, and their 200 men began the hunt for hostile Comanches.
I think so. That's where
and crossed the Red River into what was then called Indian Territory.
The Native Americans went wrong. The Indians went wrong.
And this action was significant.
Too many tribes were fighting against each other, and everybody jumped to the fact that they weren't looking to each other as a people or a nation. They're looking to each other as a fighting tribe versus tribe.
The Rangers and their allies should not have been able to take action in Oklahoma. But boundaries and borders rarely troubled the Rangers, or anyone else in America. After crossing into Oklahoma, the column turned toward the Washita River in early May and discovered a trail leading into the Antelope Hills. The signs indicated there was a camp in the area. As the sun rose on May 12th, 1858, Ford arrayed his 200 men for an attack on the camp. At 7 a.m., they charged. The Rangers and the Warriors opened fire and quickly destroyed the tiny camp of 5 lodges. But 2 Comanches escaped the fight, and now they galloped toward the Canadian River. The Rangers and the Warriors galloped after them. The chase lasted 3 miles until the 2 warriors raced into a larger Comanche camp on the banks of Little Rogue Creek. The Rangers reined in. They saw at least 70 lodges, and somewhere between 300 and 600 warriors. The leader was Chief Iron Jacket, who liked to wear an old coat of Spanish armor in battle. The 2 running Comanches hurried into the camp and shouted the alarm. Braves streamed out of the lodges. They hustled the women and children away from the Rangers. They leapt on their ponies and prepared for battle. Chief Iron Jacket moved out in front. He believed he was invincible in his Spanish armor, and his warriors thought it had powerful magic that could keep him safe. If the armor had stopped bullets in the past, it didn't now. Rifle shots rang out from the Texans' line. Iron Jacket's horse screamed and jumped, and then fell over dead. Iron Jacket crashed to the ground with gaping holes in his chest. He was probably dead before he hit the dirt, and the warriors stared in horror at their fallen leader. A moment later, the Texans charged. 200 Rangers and warriors.
Alright, time for me to switch to the back.
They slammed into as many as 600 Comanches who were demoralized by the loss of Chief
Break
Iron
time.
Jacket and Rangers and their allies routed the Comanches. They killed 76 and wounded many more, while only losing 2 themselves. After the engagement that was called the Battle of Antelope Hills, or the Battle of Little Robe Creek, Rip Ford made his report to the governor. He said, "The Comanches could be followed, overtaken, and beaten, provided the pursuers are laborious, vigilant, and willing to undergo privations." Governor Runnels was thrilled, but Ford's strike into Oklahoma and the patrols by the Army still weren't enough.
Oh boy.
Reports of attacks all over the northwest frontier continued.
All right, let me switch from front to back. I think I got everything in the front. I'll recheck later. I wish I had that 360 view.
And other ranger captains in all directions to hunt down any native person who wasn't on a reservation.
Where's the back?
He told them, pay no regard to treaty
There you go.
stipulations between them, the Indians, and the government of the United States. In the eyes of many people, Rip Ford was riding high after his work in the Nueces Strip in the early 1850s
Okay.
and his campaigns in 1858. He was even approached about running for governor, but he declined the offer. He had earned praise from all quarters for his actions, but in early 1859, he was rebuked by some people for his lack of action. After Christmas, 1858, a group of white men ambushed 15 peaceful Caddo Indians west of Fort Worth. The white men killed 7 natives, including 3 women. Resentment of the people on the reservations had now boiled over to foul murder, as Indian agent Robert Neighbors called it. A judge in Waco issued arrest warrants for a gunman named Peter Garland and the other men who were accused of the crime. The warrants were sent to Rip Ford for execution, but Ford pushed back, refusing to serve the warrants. He argued that he was a soldier, not a peace officer. His job was to fight native warriors, not enforce civilian criminal statutes. And although he was correct in his strict interpretation of the law, many people, including the governor, were not happy. Ford and the prosecutor battled in the newspapers for weeks until Governor Runnels was forced to weigh in. He issued an order to Ford that said, if you're told to serve an arrest warrant by a peace officer or a judge,
You
do
do
it. But after all this time, the warrants were never served, and the criminals never stood trial.
Bet you those warrants are still
The whole
active.
affair was dirty, and it left a bad taste in people's mouths. And it was also the last straw for the reservation experiment in Texas. That summer, the summer of 1859, Texas declared the reservation system a failure. In September, Indian agent Robert Neighbors was forced to close the reservations he'd worked so hard to open. He now had the awful task of marching nearly 1,500 people north to Fort Cobb in Oklahoma, 150 miles away. They were guarded by a company of rangers. Neighbors had devoted 15 years of his life to negotiating peace between Texans and native tribes. It was a losing battle, and in the end, he lost. Not long after he returned to Fort Belknap, a man walked up to him and shot him in the back. The reason was never fully explained. Exactly 2 weeks after Robert Neighbors was murdered in North Texas, Juan Cortina rode into Brownsville in South Texas and screamed, "Death to the Americans," and took over the town. The trouble had begun in July when Cortina had witnessed the sheriff of Brownsville pistol whipping a man in the street. The man was an aging vaquero who had worked for Cortina, and he was possibly drunk, and the sheriff was trying to make an arrest. Cortina shot the sheriff in the shoulder and escaped with his former employee. They fled to Matamoros on the other side of the Rio Grande River, and Cortina was celebrated as a hero. He was the son of a wealthy cattle ranching family who resented the American presence in South Texas. After he saved his old friend, fighters began to flock to his banner. 2 months later, in September 1859, he stormed
Jeez, I forgot
Brownsville
a
with 70
lot.
men and took control of the town.
With the red.
They killed
I'm sure I'll
5
come back and do it
citizens
again.
in the attack and held the town for most of the
As soon
day
as I'm done with this
until they
silver.
retreated to the safety of a nearby ranch. 2 weeks later, a county sheriff rounded up a posse and went after Cortina. The sheriff captured that old vaquero who is now Cortina's top lieutenant. He took the man back to Brownsville, and Cortina threatened to burn down the entire town if the man was not released. The sheriff refused to let him go. Up in San Antonio, a 26-year-old businessman named William Tobin took it upon himself to raise 50 volunteers and ride to Brownsville. Governor Runnels found out about the militia while they were on their way, so he authorized them to form a kind of unofficial ranger company. Tobin's volunteers arrived in November, and the problem immediately got worse. On November 13th, the old vaquero, Cortina's lieutenant, was taken from jail and lynched in the town square. After that, rumors swirled around Austin. People said Cortina had destroyed Brownsville in retaliation, and he was now marching toward Corpus Christi with 1,000 men. Governor Runnels ordered Rip Ford and a company of rangers to rush to Corpus Christi. The same day, regular army troops began their march from San Antonio to Brownsville. 4 days later, down in Brownsville, a company of rangers fought Cortina's men on the plain of Palo Alto, the site of the first big battle of the Mexican-American War. The next day, William Tobin and his volunteers tested Cortina's men and were met with heavy fire. Many of his undisciplined troops fled back to Brownsville. 2 days after that, Tobin tried to attack Cortina again, this time at his ranch. Tobin quickly realized he was outnumbered and retreated back to Brownsville. At that point, many of his men decided they'd had enough of this business down in South Texas, and they headed home. The army showed up 10 days later, and then Rip Ford and his rangers arrived. Now it was really a mess. There was a half-assed militia commanded by a weak leader in Tobin. There was the army, and there was a company of hardened rangers under the most respected captain in the state. It was Ford, with minor help from Tobin, who finally ended 6 months of fighting on the American side of the border that became known as Cortina's War. 2 days after Christmas 1859, Ford and his 80 rangers fought a heated battle with Cortina's men near Rio Grande City, about 100 miles upriver from Brownsville. The rangers won a decisive victory. Cortina's men suffered heavy losses, and he and the survivors fled across the Rio Grande and into Mexico. Now, he became a bandit captain and conducted raids into Texas over the next few months. Ford stayed in South Texas and fought Cortina in the new year of 1860. After almost 9 months of fighting, the Secretary of War delivered an ultimatum to Mexico. Stop Cortina, or the U.S. Army will stop him, and it'll march into Mexico if it has to. The man who delivered this message was Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was back in Texas with the cavalry. Ford and his rangers dealt Cortina 2 more serious blows in early 1860 before Lee arrived on the scene to separate the two sides on behalf of the U.S. government. The rangers beat Cortina, but never caught him. A few years later, he became a general, and then a governor until he was thrown in prison by Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz. By the time Cortina died in 1892, he had outlived many of the men who had fought him, but not John Rip Ford. And this is where we'll end Ford's story for the moment. After his service along the Rio Grande, his unit was disbanded by the new governor, Sam Houston. Houston still wanted a permanent ranger force, but he still didn't have the money to pay for it. Ford's Rio Grande squadron disbanded in the spring of 1860. In the fall, there was one more noteworthy expedition by the Texas Rangers before the country became consumed with talk of civil war. That expedition proved to be one of the most famous in Ranger history. Next time, it's the final chapter of this stretch of Texas Rangers history. It's a story I've been saving since the earliest days of the show, and it's time to tell it. It's the saga of the Parker family and the return of Cynthia Ann Parker by Texas Rangers Charlie Goodnight and Saul Ross. The events that inspired the movie The Searchers is next time on the Legends of the Old West podcast. The theme song, Yellow Rose of Texas, was arranged and recorded by the Mighty Orc in Houston, Texas. Much of the music for this show was produced by Rob Valier in Phoenix. And a very special thank you to Matt Lowry in Ireland for producing color images of these famous Texas Rangers for the first time. Matt is a world-renowned photographer whose project My Colorful Past breathes new life into old photos. Check out his Facebook page for more of his work. And, as always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. You can check out our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, for more details, and follow us on social media for news of the show. Our Facebook page is Legends of the Old West Podcast, and our handles on Twitter and Instagram are @OldWestPodcast. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.
Have you heard? McDonald's, the burger OG, took their classic burgers back to the kitchen, and they've come out hotter, juicier, and tastier. Onions added at the grill, perfectly melted cheese. Plus, the burger icon, the Big Mac, now has more Mac sauce. Just how good are these burgers? Rumble, rumble. Yep, they're so good they got the Hamburglar's attention. Better get down there before he eats them all. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Available at most restaurants in this area.
Technology helps keep everyone comfortable in their homes with a smart thermostat. But to keep everyone on your team working comfortably, you need more than technology. You need CDW to custom configure Dell Client Solutions devices. Adaptive AI-based software creates a more personalized
I don't know if
user
that does
experience
anything.
and boosts collaboration, so your team can stay cool and collected. That's better. Dell Client Solutions make adaptive performance possible. CDW makes it powerful. Learn more at cdw.com/DellClient.
This episode is brought to you by Azo. This is for my listeners with a vagina. Ever felt off balance down there? Introducing Azo Vaginal Health Products. Azo Complete Feminine Balance helps restore the balance of good bacteria. And if you want protection from yeast and urinary tract issues, try Azo Dual Protection. Save 20% with the promo code PODCAST at azoproducts.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. 24-year-old Charlie Goodnight huddled inside his coat as he and his horse trudged through the biting cold of a December day in 1860. He had been over this same ground 2 weeks earlier while chasing a Comanche raiding party, but the warriors had been too fast to catch. Now he was back on the trail as the lead scout for a group made up of rangers, federal troops, and local militiamen. They were in pursuit of another raiding party, but the frigid temperatures were taking a toll on the men and their horses. Thousands of buffalo roamed the area, but Charlie still found signs of the raiding party in the confusion of tracks. The company
I gotta
trailed
find a
the
comfortable
party until
spot.
sundown, and then camped along the banks of the Peace River. They built meager fires and pulled their coats tight around their shoulders to protect against the bitterly cold wind that shouted down from the north. The next day, rain added more misery to their lives. But they discovered a fresh
Then I
trail
gotta
that
do this.
reinvigorated some of the men. A party of rangers and federal troopers split off from the company and followed the trail along the banks of Mule Creek, a stream that fed into Peace River. They discovered a small Comanche camp and devised a quick plan of attack. The rangers would strike from one side and the cavalry would strike from the other. The fight that followed would be one of the most hotly debated and controversial events in Texas history. Over the next 70 years, accounts of the fight would be enlarged and revised and embellished by numerous people, some of whom were never there. And almost exactly 100 years later, it became immortalized in The Searchers, the film directed by John Ford that starred John Wayne and Natalie Wood. This is the story of Cynthia Ann Parker, her capture by the Comanches, and her recapture by Texas Ranger Saul Ross.
Oh, True Grit. I think that's the name of the movie.
From Black Barrel Media, this is Season 5 of the Legends of the Old West podcast, presented by the Cowboy Lifestyle Network. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this is the final episode of a 5-part series on the Texas Rangers. After the story, stick around for an interview with Justice Ken Wise, the host and creator of Wise About Texas, a Texas history podcast.
Some say a rising tide lifts all boats. The truth is, the tide has left many people behind. And while most simply comment, share a few links, and move on, students at Aligned International University prefer to act, pursuing graduate degrees under dedicated professors and faculty, alongside others who believe in equity, inclusivity, and social justice. Let's challenge the culture of complacency and start to succeed on purpose. Learn more at alliant.edu/purpose.
At Pennzoil, we have one job. Pioneering motor oil so advanced, you don't have to think about your motor oil. Instead, you can think about how your engine sounds, how your stomach feels as the RPMs build, how your wheels hug the curves, and how, with the Pennzoil Platinum up to 15-year, 500,000-mile protection guarantee, your adventures
It's going to be hard to get the arc reactor going in this one.
Find it at Firestone Complete Auto Care. Enrollment required. Keep your receipts. Other conditions apply. See pennzoil.com/warranty.
Keep your receipts.
And now, here's episode 5 of the Texas
That's a true fact. If you ever do your own motor oil, keep your receipts if your car is under warranty. That way, if something happens to your engine, you can show proof that you did an oil change.
The country around the Navasota River looked perfect to the Parkers. The soil of the rolling plains that spread out before them was rich for planting crops.
How many times they
The open landscape was studded with live oak trees,
replace engines?
and there were deer and wild turkeys everywhere. The Parkers and a few other families arrived
That wasn't
in
under
Texas
warranty
in
because people threw away their
1833 by way of
receipts
Virginia,
for doing their own oil
Tennessee,
change.
and then Illinois. Elder John Parker and his son Daniel led the party to this spot along the Navasota, a tributary of the mighty Brazos River, in about 1834, and they immediately started building. They constructed a square fort made of logs with lookout towers on 2 corners. The families in the group built small cabins in a neat row inside the fort. They began to farm a 12-mile stretch of the bottomlands near the Navasota River, and things were good for a
There you
little while.
go. For now.
Their small settlement was about 40 miles straight east of the modern city of Waco, and the closest Native Americans to the fort were the Wacos who lived along the Brazos, though this area actually belonged to the Wichitas. In 1835 and 1836, the Parkers were worried about the troubles with Mexico, like all the families in Texas, even though they were well north of the fighting. But their primary concern up here was the growing animosity between white settlers and the native tribes in the area. And the Parkers were out here on their own. They were farther west than any other white settlers.
Jeez.
They had built their fort, but if it didn't protect them, there was no chance of help from anyone else. In the spring of 1836, just 1 month after Sam Houston and the Texian army beat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, the Parkers' luck ran out. May 19th, 1836 was a pleasant day, and most of the men of Parker's fort were out in the fields. The women and children busied themselves with tasks inside the fort, and a few men had stayed behind to help. So they were about as vulnerable as they could be when a large party of Native Americans rode up to the fort. The party was mostly Comanches, but also had Kiowas, Wichitas, and Kanawins. They waved a white flag that signaled they wanted to talk. Elder John Parker was uneasy about the situation. From his family, only his sons Silas and Ben were in the fort. Samuel Frost and his son were also there, but they were the only 5 men in the stockade. The native party probably numbered about 100, and Ben Parker felt he had no choice but to go out and talk. He walked out of the walls of the fort and communicated with the party through broken English and sign language. Ben returned to the fort fort and told the others that the warriors wanted directions to a nearby water hole, and they wanted beef to eat. Ben was nervous. He thought the warriors could become hostile at any moment. Silas begged him not to go back out, but Ben insisted on returning to the party to avoid a fight through conversation. As soon as Ben arrived, the warriors shrieked and surrounded him. They drove their lances into him and killed him on the spot. Other warriors charged toward the fort. Silas rushed to the gate, but he couldn't close it in time. Warriors streamed into the fort and attacked the settlers. They killed Silas at the gate and then rode down old John Parker, the patriarch of the clan. They murdered him in a brutal, gory fashion and mutilated his body. They attacked his wife, known as Granny Parker, and left her for dead. They killed Samuel Frost and his son Robert. They attacked the other women in the fort and left them severely wounded. Out in the fields, the men of the families began to run back to the fort. Lucy Parker, the wife of Silas, grabbed her 4 children and hurried out of the gate as the melee of screaming violence swirled all around them. They ran toward the Navasota River, but the warriors galloped up behind them and grabbed them all. The warriors threw Lucy and her kids onto their horses and began to flee. David Falconberry was the first to arrive from the fields, and he fought the warriors with his rifle. He forced them to drop Lucy and 2 of her children, but the warriors rushed away with the other 2. The 2 kids were 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker and her 6-year-old brother John. As the men of the fort rushed in from the fields, the warriors turned their ponies and galloped away. They had killed 5 people, injured and mauled several others, and taken 5 prisoners. In addition to Cynthia Ann and John, the warriors captured Elizabeth Kellogg, Rachel Plummer, and Rachel's young son James, who was just 15 months old. At dawn the next day, the raiding party split up. Elizabeth Kellogg went with the Caddoans or the Wichitas and stayed with them for roughly 6 months in eastern Texas. She was then sold to a band of Delawares who turned her over to Indian agents in Texas. At that point, she vanishes from history. The Comanches kept Rachel Plummer and the 3 children. Rachel became the slave of a warrior and was treated to relentless beatings and degrading torments, especially at the hands of the Comanche women. After the raid, the Parkers and the Plumbers began the exhaustive search for their lost family members, and little by little, it started to pay off. About a year and a half later, Rachel was spotted in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. An American trader named Don arranged for her release, and he and his wife took Rachel to Independence, Missouri, and then back to Texas. They had been able to buy her from the Comanches, but they could not make a deal for the 3 white children who were still captives. And, as with many women who were captured and then returned to white society, Rachel could not readjust. She died within a year of her return. Cynthia's brother John and Rachel's son James were located in 1842 and successfully ransomed. By that point, James was 6 years old and spoke no English, but he was young enough to readjust to white civilization. John Parker was not. He was 12, and he had just been taken away from his sister Cynthia Ann. He was closer to her than anyone else in the world, and when he grew old enough, he ran away to try to find her. But by that point, the Comanches who held her were out of reach, and John never found her. He eventually married a young woman from Mexico and settled near the Rio Grande. Cynthia Ann Parker was the last remaining captive of the raid on Parker's fort. By the time her brother John was ransomed in 1842, she was 15 years old and the wife of a warrior. The Comanches refused to let her go. For the next 19 years, she was mostly lost to the records of white society. She assimilated into Comanche culture and began having children with her new husband, Petanacona. 7 years after John Parker and little James Plummer returned to their families, Shapley Ross moved his family to the tiny village of Waco on the banks of the Brazos River, 40 miles west of Fort Parker. Ross had been a ranger in Texas during the Mexican-American War, and after his discharge in 1849, he bought 4 lots in Waco. He owned a ferry that ran across the river and more than 200 acres of farmland. And at that point, he had 7 children to help him with his labor. His daughters Mary and Margaret came first, and then 2 boys followed, Peter and Lawrence. These first 4 children were born in Van Buren County in Iowa Territory before Shapley moved his family to Texas in 1839. And by the time they arrived in Waco, Lawrence Ross was 11 years old. Shapley Ross wanted good educations for his children, and it turned out that his wife Catherine was a better teacher than any the kids found at their formal schools. At 17 years old, Lawrence Ross enrolled at Baylor University in Independence, Texas. He completed the 2-year program and decided he wanted to continue his education. He packed up and headed to Wesleyan University in Florence, Alabama. But in the summer of 1858, while he was home in Waco on summer break, his life of study took an adventurous turn, one that almost got him killed. That spring, Texas Ranger Captain John Rip Ford had tracked the Comanches across the Red River and attacked a camp in Oklahoma. His expedition received high praise in Texas. Now it was the Army's turn to organize a mission against the Comanches, and it put Major Earl Van Dorn in charge of the expedition. Shapley Ross and a group of warriors from the Brazos Reservation had fought with Rip Ford on his expedition, and now Van Dorn wanted their help on his new expedition. But Ross was very sick at the time, so his son Lawrence Sullivan Ross took over as the leader of the warrior contingent. And by this point, nobody called Lawrence by his first name. He was known simply as Sol Ross. In mid-September 1858, the expedition left Fort Belknap in search of Comanches. The column consisted of 4 companies of cavalry, 2 companies of mounted infantry, and more than 100 warriors with Sol Ross. The expedition traveled north and crossed the Red River into Oklahoma, and their scouts found a trail near Otter Creek in present-day Tillman County, Oklahoma.
I am going very slow.
The scouts followed the trail and discovered a combined camp of Comanches, Wichitas, Chickasaws, and Choctaws.
Now it's all about
the Comanches had set up this meeting of tribes to essentially apologize to the Wichitas. They thought the Wichitas had helped Texas Ranger Rip Ford on his expedition 4 months earlier, and they had retaliated by stealing Wichita horses. Then they found out the Wichitas were not involved, and now they were making amends. Ross's scouts rushed to the main column to tell him of the camp. They reported that there were 400 to 600 people in the camp, and it was about 40 miles away. So Major Earl Van Dorn quickly told the expedition to pack up and get moving. But now there was a communication breakdown.
There you go.
The 2 scouts who had found the camp didn't fully understand the American system of measuring distance. The camp wasn't 40 miles away, it was 90 miles away. The column marched all morning, and then all afternoon, and then all evening without finding the Comanche camp. Finally, Van Dorn called a halt near a creek to rest the horses and let the men brew some coffee. But after the break, they climbed back into their saddles and began trekking through the night. At daybreak, they closed in on the camp. The men and the horses were exhausted. They had been on the move for 36 hours straight.
This is where I broke it. I broke the arm off.
They arrayed themselves for battle.
But I'm not going to waste it,
At
so
7
I'm going
a.m.,
to paint it
the
as best
bugler
as I
sounded
could.
the call to charge, and the column descended on the sleeping camp. The soldiers attacked from
As
one
best as
side,
I can.
while Ross and the warriors stampeded the horses on the other side.
Good practice.
Sleepy warriors poured out of their lodges to fight the troopers. They shielded the women and children so they could escape. The braves ran for their horses, but Ross's group had driven them out of reach. Ross and his warriors turned and charged into the fight, but he noticed a group of natives fleeing in a different direction, and he spurred his horse toward them. He shouted for the others to follow, but in the confusion, only 3 men stayed with him. The four men raced toward the escapees and then discovered they were women and children, not fighters. But Ross had also noticed one little girl was white. He instructed his scout to grab her, and as the four men turned back toward the general engagement, they realized they were cut off from their companions. 25 warriors blocked the path to the main body of American troops. They opened fire on Ross and his three men. A lieutenant went down immediately, shot through the heart with an arrow. Then an army private was hit. Ross raised his Sharps rifle to return fire, but it malfunctioned. A Comanche arrow pierced his shoulder. Then a warrior fired an old Springfield carbine at point-blank range and blew Ross off his horse.
Dead.
Ross crashed to the ground. As the warrior stood over him with a scalping knife in his hand, Ross was sure he would die. But then the cavalry rushed to his aid, and the lieutenant blasted the warrior with a shotgun. A Caddo scout dressed Ross's wounds for the long trip back home. In 2 hours of fighting, 56 warriors lay dead. The village was destroyed. The camp supplies were gone, and the horses had been scattered. Saul Ross survived the trip home and recovered from his wounds at his family's house in Waco. General Winfield Scott was so impressed by the young man that he offered him a commission, but Ross turned it down so that he could finish college, which he did in June of 1859. But before he went to Alabama to complete his degree, he tried to find the family of the little white girl who had been rescued in the expedition. He couldn't find them, so he and his fiancée, Elizabeth, adopted her and named her Lizzie, and raised her as their own child.
People don't do that
Sam
shit
Houston
nowadays.
began his final service to the state of Texas in December 1859 as its 7th governor. 3 months later, he called for another expedition against the Comanches, who still terrorized the northwest frontier. Saul Ross joined up with a company of Texas Rangers for the expedition, but this one would not have the results of his previous experience. In June of 1860, more than 300 Rangers struck out for the Comancheria, the homeland of the Comanches. But a month later, after crisscrossing the northwest part of the state, they hadn't laid eyes on the Comanche warrior. And after the Comanches lit a wall of fire to burn the prairie, many Rangers decided it was time to go home. Men started to disperse in mid-July, and Governor Houston officially canceled the expedition in early August. The regiment trudged on without accomplishing anything while costing the state $1,500 per day. And Houston was not happy. Even though Saul Ross had not been in charge of the operation, many people blamed him for its failure. In October of 1860, settlers were calling for his resignation. There were even whispers of a lynching that might be in the works. But despite the criticism, there were those who supported Ross, and Houston was one of them. He put the young ranger in command of another company, and that company began to conduct regular patrols. And then, in November, 2 things happened that would have a lasting impact on the history of Texas and the history of the nation. The Comanches went on a killing spree. They butchered 6 people in rapid succession, 5 of whom were women. And Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. The butchery in Parker County that November of 1860 put Saul Ross on the path toward one of the most controversial events in Texas history. Ross heard that a group of hostile Comanches was camped along the Peace River, just a few miles southwest of the Texas-Oklahoma border.
This one?
He took 40 Rangers and rode to Camp Cooper. The commander of Camp Cooper gave him 20 cavalrymen under the leadership of Sergeant John Spangler. The team of 60 men then added about 70 local volunteers. By early December, the entire force had assembled, and they rode north into the teeth of a bitter cold front. Charlie Goodnight, a 24-year-old rancher from the area, took the lead and guided the party. He was the only one with knowledge of the territory, and not long ago he had been over this same ground in pursuit of a raiding party. Now he was the lead scout for the expedition, and he guided the men over a series of creeks as they worked their way north. They crossed the Big Wichita River and then finally reached the Peace River on the evening of December 17th. By that point, the expedition was struggling. The terrible weather and the lack of food had taken its toll on the men and the horses. The column was now strung out over a couple miles. Half the rangers had fallen behind the leaders. All of the local volunteers had fallen behind. Only about 40 men were healthy enough to keep up a decent pace, and they were a combination of rangers and cavalry troopers. A little more than a day later, on the morning of December 19th, 1860, Sol Ross and the men who now led the expedition discovered a fresh trail and began to follow it. They soon spotted a small village of between 5 and 10 lodges nestled on the banks of Mule Creek near its junction with the Peace River. There were around 15 people in the hunting camp who packed their belongings as if they were preparing to leave. They were mostly women and children who were traditionally responsible for transporting the goods of the camp. Sol Ross divided his force. He led the rangers, who numbered as many as 20.
There's a bunch of shit I forgot.
Sergeant Spangler led maybe 20 cavalrymen around the right side.
But you gotta
As the
fix,
villagers
damn it.
packed up their gear and got ready to leave, the troops attacked. The Comanches saw the charge at the last second. They had no time to mount or build defense. The rangers and
Which
the
is fine,
soldiers
it gives
began firing.
the gray time to.
Women and children ran through the camp, terrified and screaming. The few Comanche men who were there grabbed weapons and tried to fight back. A ranger was about to fire on a warrior, but then the ranger's horse stopped abruptly. The ranger nearly fell off his mount, but his slide caused him to escape the arrow fired by the warrior. Sol Ross hurried into the fray and killed the warrior in hand-to-hand combat. As the main attack happened in the heart of the camp, several Comanches were able to run to their horses and gallop away. American horsemen took off after the fleeing Comanches. In the chaos and confusion, one of the Comanche riders was nearly shot, but then she revealed herself to be a woman, and she was carrying an infant child. Not only that, but she appeared to be white. Her skin was heavily tanned and very dirty, but her blue eyes were unmistakable. The horsemen collected her and brought her back to camp, where the brief fight was now done. It lasted about 20 minutes, and the rangers and troopers didn't have so much as a scratch on them. But somewhere between 7 and 15 Comanches lay dead on the ground. The majority of the dead were women. Sol Ross took care of a young boy who was thought to be the son of the man he had killed in the hand-to-hand fight. He took the boy home with him and named him Peace Ross. But it was the white woman and her infant daughter who would ignite a firestorm of excitement about the event. The rangers and the soldiers took the woman and her child to Camp Cooper. The woman's uncle, Isaac Parker, eventually identified her as his long-lost niece, Cynthia Ann Parker. But the identification process was difficult. She had been gone for more than 20 years. She spoke little to no English. She had trouble remembering and even saying her original name. By this point, she considered herself Nadawa, the wife of a warrior named Petanacona. They had 3 children together, 2 boys and the infant daughter she held in her arms. But she would never see her boys or her husband again. She would never witness the death of her younger son from disease, or see her eldest boy grow up tall and strong. She would never be able to mourn the loss of her husband, who likely died less than 2 years after her capture at Peace River. Cynthia Ann returned to white society, but it was now a foreign culture. She was being held against her will. She desperately wanted to return to her Comanche family, and she tried to escape numerous times. But each time, she was caught and brought back. Within a couple years, her young daughter died, and she sank deeper into depression. She starved herself to death and passed away sometime in the second half of the 1860s. But that was certainly not the end of her story or her legacy. Her eldest son was Quanah Parker, and he became the last great chief of the Comanches. And the story of this relatively small engagement along the banks of Mule Creek near Peace River took on a life of its own. For the next 70 years, the story was revised, altered, embellished, exaggerated, and expanded by numerous people who were there, and at least one who wasn't. Texas Ranger Captain Saul Ross gave at least 6 different accounts in the decades that followed. Each time, the action grew a little larger, and his role became a little more heroic. He rode the story of the rescue of Cynthia Ann Parker right into the governor's office in 1886 by claiming, among other things, that the man he had killed in the fight was Cynthia Ann's husband, Nakona, a great chief of the Comanches. The prevailing wisdom today is that it's almost certain Nakona and his 2 sons were not at the hunting camp that day in 1860. But at the time, in 1860, Ross was praised by Governor Houston for his good work and offered command of a new company of rangers.
Damn it.
But the calendar had flipped from 1860 to 1861, and now there were only 2 topics on the minds of Americans: secession and Civil War. In March 1861, Texas voted to secede from the Union. Governor Houston thought it was a terrible idea and refused to go along with it, and he was removed from power. The country, which was now 2 countries, was just 1 month away from the first shots of the Civil War. Texas Rangers Ben McCullough, Rick Ford, and Sol Ross joined the Confederate Army, but Bigfoot Wallace had the same opinion as Sam Houston. Wallace said after it was all over, "I wanted nothing to do with that war. I did not want to see the Union dissolved, and I could not fight against Old Virginia, and I would have fought a regiment before I would have shouldered a musket on either side." Many people felt the same way, but the course had been charted, and there was no turning back. The next time we hear from the Texas Rangers, they're going back to war.
Flexibility is great. That's why there's yoga. Flexibility for your insurance coverage is great too. That's why there's United Healthcare Insurance Plans. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, United Healthcare Insurance Plans offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage for medical, vision, dental, and more. One of these plans may be right for you if you're, say, between jobs, coming off your parents' plan, turning a side hustle, or even missed open enrollment.
Oh boy.
For more flexibility, find out more about United
Where did I
Healthcare
miss to?
Insurance Plans
I
at
know I missed
UH1.com.
more.
This episode is brought to you by Dave. When you need money in a pinch, Dave can help. It's a banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly. No interest, late fees, or credit check. Join the millions already using Dave to get financial relief and sign up for an extra cash account to get up to $500 instantly. Go to dave.com/Spotify or download the Dave app now. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking services provided by Evolve Bank and Trust, member FDIC.
Thanks for listening to Season 5 of the Legends of the Old West podcast.
What else did I miss?
This season was edited and mixed by Michael Martin at Sneaky Big Studios in Phoenix, Arizona. The theme song, Yellow Rose of Texas, was arranged and recorded by the Mighty Orc in Houston, Texas. Much of the music for this show was produced by Rob Valier in Phoenix. Sketches of General Scott's grand entrance into Mexico City and a Texas Ranger were provided by the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum and Dickinson Research Center in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And the great color images of Texas Rangers you saw throughout the season were produced by Matt Lowry in Ireland. Matt is a world-renowned photographer whose project My Colorful Past breathes new life into old photos. Check out his Facebook page for more of his work. Again, thank you for listening, and thanks to everyone who's given the show a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. Please check out our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, for more details, and follow us on social media for news of the show. Our Facebook page is Legends of the Old West Podcast, and our handles on Twitter and Instagram are @Old West Podcast. And now, here's my conversation with Justice Ken Wise on location at the new San Felipe de Austin Museum outside Sealy, Texas.
I think that was it.
All right, Judge Wise, thank you very much for coming back to the show. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a treat.
Yeah, we're back here. As we were just talking about, I think it's a little over a year since our last interview. We're kind of making this a yearly crossover event between Wise About Texas and Legends of the Old West.
I hope so. Let's hope so.
Yeah, and specifically about the Texas Rangers, of course. Maybe someday we'll find another topic to talk about, but for now, it's still Texas Rangers.
Yeah, that's been a great series. You've done wonderful work on that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and certainly this is, man, it's come a long way since the first interview we did at the headquarters of Wise About Texas.
That's right.
Now, as listeners have already heard in the setup, we're here at the San Felipe de Austin Museum, really cool new museum down here outside Sealy, Texas. So this is a much more fitting place for a discussion about the Texas Rangers. This is kind of where it all started.
It's literally where it all started. It's where Austin was. It was his headquarters. And that famous letter that we consider the genesis of the Texas Ranger Force today in 1823 was written from here. So it's a
I keep
special
bumping.
place.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm
So
trying to get a
today,
good
David,
place
we were
for
preparing
light.
For this interview, we were kind of joking around that I only have 2 questions for you. I have exactly 2 questions,
All right.
but each one is going to kind of go in different avenues. So there are going to be several branches on the tree. But let's just jump right into the very first one. And I'm going to have a little preface for this, in that I want to. It's somewhat designed to put in this story of Cynthia Ann Parker into a little bit of historical context with the early years of Texas history. Let's say 8 to be round numbers, 1820 to about 1900, those early famous years. So I think when people think about those years of Texas history, the Old West version of Texas history, obviously they probably think of the Alamo as number one. The first Texas history event that comes into mind is probably the Alamo, probably followed shortly thereafter by the Goliad Massacre, the Battle of San Jacinto, those early pivotal Texas Revolution years. But as I started thinking about it, I started wondering how far up the ladder, how far or down the rankings maybe would the story of Cynthia Ann Parker fall. It feels like it could be very close to the top, and it's the story of a single person. One single person story when compared with the siege of the Alamo, the massacre of Goliad, the Battle of San Jacinto. I feel like it might have
Stretch my legs again, and then I'll come back.
Maybe up there in the rankings. So the question then becomes, how or why has the story of Cynthia Ann Parker endured over all these years?
Right. Well, I think your analysis is exactly right. I think one of the things, there are phases of Texas history that are, as Texas is, bigger and grander, and they're romanticized.
It doesn't have to be 100%
So you have the
accurate.
Revolution, which is its own story with the Alamo and
But I do
Goliad
gotta-
and San Jacinto, as you mentioned. And then you have that Old West period where we have the cowboys. And one of the big features of that time, unfortunately, were the Indian Wars, which played a huge role in Texas history. And part of that is some of the tactics that the Indians used to intimidate the settlers. They would capture children and make them part of the tribe. And I think it was really done to repopulate the tribe, is what my research revealed.
Interesting,
But it was a very common practice. And so you have in Cynthia Ann Parker, you have a story of someone that was captured in 1836 and becomes an Indian essentially and lives with them for a couple of decades and then is repatriated, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen all that much. And, by that time she had had children with one of the Indians. And
Oh, boy.
and then, of course, the coda to all of that is one of her children becomes essentially the last Comanche chief and a very well-known celebrity around the country. So there's just a lot of aspects to this story that set it apart.
Yeah, I think it probably is unprecedented, and I always want to qualify everything I say. Certainly that I'm not a historian. I don't spend years and years and years researching this stuff, but from what I understand, and maybe you can check me on this story seems to be unique. It seems to be one of a kind. And from what I had read, there are some sources I saw that will claim that Cynthia Ann Parker was the first recorded capture by the Comanches. I don't know if we could ever verify that. I don't know if you've seen the same thing, but it feels like there are several parts of this story that lead into this kind of unprecedented stage. That she was one of, if not the first captured, certainly for a long period of time.
Getting there.
She spent more than 20 years with the Comanches. She assimilated into their culture, learned the language, and then was repatriated, as you say. I was trying to figure out the right word. Rescued, recaptured. I've seen so many different ways. I don't know if there is a right term for her being brought back into white society. And then, yes, having the son Quanah Parker, who goes on to become the last Great Chief of the Comanches. So all of those things mixed together, you put all of those elements together, and you do have this one-of-a-kind story. And so I guess, let me throw out a kind of a sub-question is, how much of that stuff have you read, too, that her being one of the earliest captured people in white society and all of those different elements, how have you found any of those?
Well, I don't know, like you, I don't know that we can ever know if she was literally the first person, but you know, the Parkers settled in very early on in Texas, and just the Parker family coming here and what they did, they came and they built a fort, and so and you know, not many families these days have family forts, but the Parker family had a fort, and there were people that were not part of the Parker family with them. So there was this little mini colony of folks that came down and were either brave or stupid enough to build outside the frontier and built a fort, which of course was a good idea. And you know, so that in and of itself is pretty unique, but it was also very early. And so it's when the Indians attacked the Parkers, it was a very early example of what settlers would later in fact face. And so you could almost characterize it as a warning, you know, that maybe this wasn't going to be as easy as we all thought it might be to colonize this land called Texas. So I think because it was so early in our history, it is kind of one of the early moments of the trouble that the settlers would later have with the Comanches.
I started really thinking about this and looking at it from like a bird's eye view, from the macro view. There's really only about 50 years of overlap between white settlements and the Comanche era before the Comanches are removed to Fort Sill in the 1870s. So there's actually a very brief time period. So it's almost physically not possible for it, or the odds of it being of another person having been captured and spending that much time with the Comanches and then reassimilating into white society. The odds of that happening are very low because there's only about a 50-year period where it could have happened, and she was gone for 20 to 25 years. So that, you know, it's I think that enhances the uniqueness of it.
Yeah, it does. And the other thing, and it's sort of a sad romance, really, is poor Cynthia Ann. She was captured against her will at age 9, and then returned much later, also against her will.
Yeah.
So she was basically captured twice. You know, from a perspective of an Anglo, you would say, well, we liberated her from her captors. Well, from her perspective, she was captured twice, and her life totally upended, fatally so, as it turns out. She just couldn't. She could never. She was depressed. We would call her today depressed. Probably some PTSD involved, and you know, she saw members of her family killed twice. And so that's, you know, you can't imagine how traumatic that must be. And I think, you know, to get her back, with her being a significant citizen of the Comanches and all that, I mean, that was just very interesting to everyone, I think, and still is.
As we said, a lot of these things have combined to help this story live throughout the years. Like you just said, she was ripped away from her family twice. The odds of us finding someone who had all of these experiences in one short lifetime. She was in her early 30s, I believe, when she was repatriated or rescued or liberated or recaptured, whichever term we want to use. So only about 25-year span of time did all of this stuff happen to her. So it was obviously a hell of a lot for one person to go through.
It really was. And of course, the history of the Indian Wars in Texas, we had the early time period, and you covered Jack Hayes in this series, who was one of the greatest Indian fighters ever. But one of the things that made him so great was he figured out how these fights were going to have to go with the Comanches. We didn't know anything about the Comanches until we started moving west.
Right.
They weren't in East Texas where Texian settlers were settling. There weren't Comanches. But as we came west to the Brazos and the Colorado regions, we learned real fast what the Comanches were capable of, but we didn't learn how to fight them. And Hayes really led that charge, pun intended, to learn how to fight the Comanches. And the way he did it was to learn to ride like one, and to use his weapons like one, and to use their tactics and to understand their tactics. Well, that was all coming to a head when Cynthia Ann was found. And that was the time period where the Indian Wars were we knew something was going to have to be done. And it was a big deal. And the railroads were starting to expand and all of those sorts of things. The ranching industry was starting to expand. It became imperative to solve, as the Anglos would put it, solve this Indian problem. And so that there was a lot of attention on that situation. When we found Cynthia Ann, that would have been called a great victory and a wonderful, job by whoever did it. And then you have the person that did it, Lawrence Sullivan Ross, who went on to be governor and was an officer in the Confederate Army and was, his own romantic figure of sorts.
He has his own history that the show will get to down the road, probably next year sometime when we come back for the trilogy, for the third installment of Texas Rangers history. His story in this series that's just wrapping up is really just getting started. His story, as far as the Texas Rangers are concerned, begins in 1858, and then obviously, like you said, he will go on to be an officer in the Civil War and then have his own trajectory. And I'll obviously touch on a little bit when he runs for governor in 1886, which will lead us to question number 2, which is the story of the rescue, if we want to use that term, of Cynthia Ann Parker and how it evolved over the years. And so we're trying to, I don't want to get into every different version that was told by every different person. There's a lot of them out there, but there are a lot of different versions, and they, like many stories, evolved and changed and got embellished over the years. So, to your knowledge, what are some of the evolutions? How did some of this stuff evolve between 1860, when Cynthia Ann was found, and then, let's say, I guess the ultimate end game of it was Sol Ross becoming governor in 1886. So a lot of the evolution happened in that 26-year period of time.
Right, and I think, when kind of what I was alluding to before, when the event happened and Cynthia Ann was found after so many, many years, that was a huge cause celeb in the country, not just Texas. And so that was a story that everybody was interested in because, again, from the perspective of an Anglo settler, citizen of Texas, you would say, wow, what a glorious thing to save that poor girl from what was considered a fate worse than death, which was to be made part of these savages, which is what they called them,
Of course.
back, or how they were regarded, and the Indians, I mean. So there was a lot of romance surrounding that story. So it's a story that would get told and retold, and when that happens, of course, things tend to get embellished. Details, strict historical details, are sometimes ignored in favor of what sounds better. And so the story changes, and the story that I always was told as a child and read about was that the gallant Lawrence Sullivan Ross leads a group of soldiers and rangers against a huge force of Indians. They fight, they win the battle, and not only do they defeat these Indians, but they also recapture this poor girl who's been held hostage for 25 years. And Lawrence Sullivan Ross kills the chief, Pettinacona. Well, great story, very romantic, and that's what I always thought had happened because that was what was written in a book in the late 1800s. Well, that's not at all what happened. When you dig down into historical detail, you discover that, it was a small group, mostly women and children, we think. Pettinacona was probably not even there, and, so most of it happened, but it sure didn't happen the way that story was initially written. And I think nowadays, as with a lot of historical stories, the further away you go from the first telling, the more accurate the history tends to become. And, as historical resources are gathered, Texas is a very young state. We're not even 200 years old. So we're still sort of gathering documents, so to speak, about our history. We're discovering things that we didn't know existed. In this case, it would be battle reports, or it would be, somebody's diary that turns up, or, turns out, I just found out recently working on this interview that Lawrence Sullivan Ross was actually interviewed by a Parker cousin, and that interview transcript survives. Well, I didn't even know that. That was discovered, so to speak, in like 2009 by some scholars. So, the story evolves more toward the truth, and we'll never know for sure. But we know a lot more than we used to.
Yeah, and like you said, we know Sol Ross gave at least 6 different accounts of the story over the years. But as we were talking about just before we turned on the microphones, what has been lost to history, unfortunately, is his immediate after-action report.
Right, missing from the archives.
Exactly.
That's right.
It went missing from the archives, so we don't know what he said immediately afterwards. And as you just referenced, some of the rangers who were there, at least one ranger who was there, kept a diary. So that's and he wrote about the event right afterwards, so we can use that as almost a pseudo after action report, and it gives us a little bit of insight. But then like you said, over time we see different versions of the stories. We have to keep tracing back to what we can find as the earliest documents, and unfortunately one of the earliest ones from Sol
This
Ross's
GoPro is way better than.
Yeah, I'm real curious about that because I'm not necessarily trying to gin up a conspiracy theory, but in whose interest would it be for that report to disappear? I mean, was it taken? Historical documents are stolen all the time. Was it taken for its value? Perhaps, it'll have Lawrence Sullivan Ross's autograph on it, so that makes it valuable to some degree. Was it stolen, in the 20th century? Was it, did someone who never wanted that to come out? Maybe it reveals that the story is not exactly as it was told in that first writing. Is that why that document's not there anymore? To many people, to us, historical documents are treasures, but to